We had been planning the camping trip for weeks, and by the time we finally hit the road, our excitement was palpable. There were four of us: me, Jenna, Mark, and Eric. We were headed to the deep woods of Whispering Pines, a remote spot recommended by Eric, known for its scenic views and pristine nature trails. Despite its beauty, a sense of isolation hung heavy over the area, a remoteness that both thrilled and unnerved us. We arrived late in the afternoon, setting up camp by a small, clear lake that mirrored the sky. The sun set as we roasted marshmallows and shared stories by the fire. Laughter filled the air, the kind of pure joy that only comes from good friends and open skies. As night deepened, the forest around us seemed to awaken. The usual sounds of crickets and distant owls were there, but beneath them, something else rustled, something that didn't quite fit the rhythmic cadence of nature. We joked about it at first, throwing out silly suggestions of forest creatures watching us. But as the night wore on, the sounds grew closer, more distinct, a series of soft, deliberate crunches like footsteps pacing just beyond the circle of our campfire light. Jenna was the first to grow seriously uneasy. "Guys, seriously, do you hear that?" she whispered during one of our louder bursts of laughter. We fell silent, straining our ears. The sounds had stopped. The silence that followed was almost more unsettling than the noises themselves. Mark tried to lighten the mood, chalking it up to a deer or some other harmless wildlife, but his voice held an edge of doubt that betrayed his fear. Unease turned to fright when the noises resumed, this time accompanied by a low, mournful wail that drifted through the trees. It was a sound none of us could place, neither animal nor human. Eric, ever the brave one, grabbed a flashlight and declared he would check it out. We protested, but he insisted, stepping into the darkness beyond our campsite. The rest of us huddled close to the fire, watching the beam of his flashlight bob among the trees until it disappeared altogether. Minutes stretched into hours, and Eric did not return. Our calls for him went unanswered, swallowed by the vast forest. Panic set in, but none of us dared follow him into the dark. Instead, we stayed by the fire, jumping at every crack and rustle, imagining horrors lurking just out of sight. Dawn broke with no sign of Eric. We ventured out together, calling his name, searching the nearby paths, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. Desperate, we decided to pack up and hike back to get help, our minds racing with terrible possibilities. As we hurriedly dismantled the camp, I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing, a part of the ground that looked disturbed, as if recently dug up and hastily covered again. Driven by a horrifying intuition, I started digging with my hands, the earth cold and damp beneath my fingers. It didn't take long before I found him. Eric, lying in a shallow grave, his face frozen in an expression of terror. I screamed, stumbling back as Jenna and Mark rushed over. Together we uncovered him, the reality of the situation sinking in. Eric had never left the campsite. He had been right there, just yards away, while we waited, terrified and helpless. The trip back was a blur of fear and grief. We contacted the authorities, who combed the area but found no trace of who or what might have done this. They suggested Eric might have had an accident, perhaps falling and hitting his head, but we knew the truth. The sounds, the wail, the deliberate burial, it was no accident. I never returned to Whispering Pines, nor did I ever go camping again. At night, in the safety of my home, I still hear those sounds, that mournful wail echoing in my dreams. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear Eric calling out to us from the darkness, begging for help that would never come. From the moment the new kid, Ethan, walked into our classroom, I knew something was off about him. He had that pale, gaunt look of someone who hadn't seen the sun in a long while, and his eyes, a piercing shade of gray, seemed to hold secrets far beyond his years. He didn't speak much, and when he did, his voice was soft, almost a whisper, yet it carried a strange authority that made you want to listen. The teachers seemed oblivious to his oddities, praising his excellent grades and polite demeanor. But the rest of us, well, we weren't so sure. There was something unsettling about Ethan, something that made your skin crawl when he looked at you for a bit too long. As weeks passed, strange occurrences began to unfold around school. It started with little things. Books going missing from backpacks, unexplained power outages, and strange, unidentifiable whispers in the hallways when it seemed no one was around. But then, the incidents grew more disturbing. One afternoon during gym class, Ethan stood alone by the bleachers. No one ever really saw him participate in sports. He always kept to himself, observing. That day, a fierce storm had rolled in unexpectedly. The sky turned dark as night and the wind howled like it was alive. Lightning struck close to the school grounds just as Ethan turned his gaze upwards, his lips moving in what appeared to be a silent conversation. At that moment, the gym lights flickered violently, and a terrible scream echoed through the building. We all rushed outside, only to find that the old oak tree by the playground had been struck, its trunk split open, revealing what looked like the charred remains of a crow nested inside. Rumors started to spread like wildfire. Some said Ethan could control the weather, others believed he was cursed. Despite the whispers and wary glances, Ethan remained indifferent, his expression never revealing a thing. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to follow him home one day. I kept a safe distance as he walked down the old forest path that led out of town. The further we went, the more the atmosphere thickened, the air growing colder, the forest around us eerily silent. Ethan stopped at the entrance to an abandoned house, its windows boarded up, the garden overrun with wild thorns. He didn't go inside but stood at the gate, staring up at the house as if waiting for something. I hid behind a tree, watching as the air around him seemed to shimmer with a strange energy. Then, just as suddenly as he had stopped, he turned and walked back the way we came, passing by my hiding spot without a glance. That night, I lay in bed, restless and uneasy. The image of the abandoned house haunted me, and a deep sense of dread settled in my bones. I decided to return there the next day, alone, to uncover what Ethan might be hiding. In daylight, the house seemed less menacing, but no less mysterious. The gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open, the sound slicing through the silence. Inside, the house was a ruin, debris and dust covering every surface. As I ventured deeper, a chill ran down my spine. In the living room, drawn in the thick layer of dust on the floor, were hundreds of circles, each with intricate symbols I couldn't recognize. In the center of this bizarre array was a picture, partly faded but unmistakably a photo of Ethan. Horrified, I stumbled back, knocking over a pile of old books. They thudded to the ground, and from one, a collection of newspaper clippings fluttered out. I picked them up, my hands trembling as I read the headlines. Local boy vanishes without trace. Unexplained phenomena plague town. Historic storm ends in tragedy. Each article was dated over 50 years ago, and each featured a photo of a boy who looked exactly like Ethan. As the reality of what I was seeing sank in, the air grew icy cold. The house seemed to close in around me, the whispers from school echoing in my ears. I ran, not stopping until I was out of the forest and back in the safety of daylight. The next day, Ethan was gone. His desk sat empty, and no one mentioned his name. It was as if he had never existed. But I know what I saw. I know that Ethan was real, and whatever he was, whatever secrets the past held, they were dark and best left alone. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howls and the sky turns the color of bruises, I can still hear the faint echo of whispers calling me back to that old haunted house in the woods. I had always lived alone in my small apartment on the outskirts of the city, a mundane but comforting existence that suited my solitary nature. The nights were usually peaceful, the quiet hum of the city a gentle lullaby that eased me into sleep. However, everything changed one stormy night when my phone erupted into a shrill ring that sliced through the silence like a knife. Bleary-eyed and disoriented, I glanced at the glowing digits of my clock. It was 3:03 a.m. An unsettling feeling crept over me as I reached for the phone, the caller ID showing only unknown. Hesitantly, I answered, my voice heavy with sleep. "Hello?" I mumbled into the receiver, waiting for a reply. Instead of words, what came through was the sound of heavy, labored breathing. It was erratic and deep, as if someone were struggling to catch their breath after a sprint. My heart raced, a mix of fear and confusion knotting in my stomach. "Who is this?" I demanded, a tremor in my voice that I couldn't control. The only response was more breathing, now interspersed with what sounded like a faint moan. Alarmed, I hung up, the eerie sound echoing in my ears. I tried to go back to sleep, convincing myself it was just a prank call, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard the breathing. It haunted the fringes of my mind, a constant, unnerving presence. The phone rang again, jolting me from my half-sleep. The clock read 3:17 a.m. With trembling hands, I answered, my voice barely a whisper. Hello? Again, the breathing filled my ear, closer, more desperate. This time, I could swear I heard my name being whispered between breaths. Stop calling me, I yelled, anger mingling with my fear. Again, I hung up, my heart pounding against my ribcage. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every shadow seemed to move and every sound was a threat. When dawn finally broke, I was a mess of nerves, the night's terror still clinging to me like a second skin. The following nights were a repetition of the same nightmare. The phone would ring, always between 3 and 3:30 a.m., and the same heavy breathing would greet me. I stopped answering, but the ringing persisted, each chime a spike of fear. Desperate for it to stop, I contacted the police, but they could do little without more evidence of a threat. My friends suggested changing my number, but something prevented me from doing so. A morbid curiosity about the identity and intentions of my nocturnal harasser. Then one night, something changed. The phone rang, and when I picked it up, instead of the usual breathing, there was silence. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, then a voice spoke, soft and chilling. Come outside. Frozen, I stood by the window, peering out into the darkness. A figure stood under the streetlight across the road. It was hooded and indistinct, but it felt as though its eyes were fixed directly on me. The phone slipped from my trembling hand, clattering to the floor. Compelled by a force I couldn't understand, I found myself unlocking my door and stepping out into the night. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy, charged with a tension that made my skin crawl. The figure remained motionless, its presence both menacing and magnetic. As I crossed the street, my mind screamed at me to turn back, but my body wouldn't obey. I was mere feet away when the figure finally moved, its hand reaching out towards me. What happened next is a blur of motion and terror. There was a sharp pain, a blinding flash of light, and then darkness. I never made it back to my apartment that night. They found my body in the early morning, lying cold and lifeless under the streetlight. The police said it was a mugging gone wrong, but I know the truth. The calls, the breathing, the final summons, it was all a carefully orchestrated lure to my death. Now I wander these streets, unseen and unheard, forever trapped in the limbo of my last moments. And sometimes, when the clock strikes 3 a.m., I find myself standing under that same streetlight, calling out to the living, my breath heavy in the chill air, hoping for someone to hear me, to save me from my endless night. It had been a particularly long day at work, so when I finally collapsed into bed, the fatigue hit me like a wave. My small one-bedroom apartment on the quieter side of town was usually a sanctuary from the bustling chaos of daily life. But that night, something was different. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to relax. Just as I was drifting off, a sudden loud knock jolted me awake. It was so forceful. My first groggy thought was that someone must have thrown something at my door. I glanced at the glowing red numbers on my digital clock, 3:15 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? With a mixture of annoyance and apprehension, I slipped out of bed and approached the door. The peephole revealed only the dimly lit hallway of my apartment building. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. There was no answer, just silence. Reluctantly, I opened the door a crack, the security chain still latched. The hallway was empty. Slightly relieved, but still uneasy, I shut the door and made sure it was locked before heading back to bed. I tried to tell myself it was just kids playing a prank, but the unease wouldn't leave me. Just as I was finally beginning to relax again, the knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. It echoed through my small apartment like a warning. This time, I didn't go to the door. Instead, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed the building's security. The phone rang and rang, but no one picked up. That was unusual. Security was supposed to be available 24/7. Heart pounding, I decided to call the police. Just as I was about to dial, another knock came, so loud I thought the door would break down. Panicked, I shouted, "I'm calling the police," hoping it would scare off whoever was out there. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, clutching my phone, but the police never arrived. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I must have dozed off. I woke up the next morning feeling unsettled but unharmed. The morning light made the fears of the night before seem like fragments of a nightmare. I even laughed at myself as I made coffee, thinking how a few loud knocks had scared me so thoroughly. But the peace didn't last. When I opened my door to leave for work, I froze. There on my doorstep was a small, intricately carved box that definitely hadn't been there before. Puzzled and cautious, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single old-fashioned key, tarnished with age, and a note written in a hurried scrawl. The note read, "Now you've heard it, you can't unhear it. The knocks will follow you until you use this key to stop them. Choose wisely where." Confused and more than a little frightened, I took the box with me, turning over the key and note in my mind all day. What door did this key belong to? What was I supposed to lock or unlock to stop these knocks? As days passed, the knocks continued, each night at exactly 3:15 a.m., no matter where I was. I tried staying with a friend, and the knocks followed. I even booked a hotel room one night, but it was the same. The relentless knocks were driving me to the edge of sanity. Finally, driven by desperation, I returned to my apartment and began trying the key in every lock, every door, but it fit none. Then, one sleepless night, as the knocks echoed again, a horrifying thought struck me. What if the key was not meant for any door in my apartment or any door in the physical world? Without really understanding why, I found myself drawn to my old, dusty basement storage unit in the building's lowest level. The place I never went because there was nothing there but old, forgotten junk. There, hidden behind old boxes, was a door I hadn't noticed before. The key fit perfectly. I turned it, locking whatever was behind it, hoping to seal it away forever. The knock stopped. Relieved, I returned to my apartment and finally slept without disturbance. But the next morning, I found another note slipped under my door in the same hurried scrawl. "You locked it away, but now it's angry. You can't unhear the knocks, and you can't undo the lock. It knows where you are." That was a week ago. Since then, I've heard nothing. No knocks, no sounds, but the silence is worse. A heavy, oppressive anticipation of something terrible that is yet to come. I know now that some doors are meant to stay locked, and some things are meant to remain hidden. And sometimes, the worst horrors are not those that stalk us from the shadows, but those that we invite into our lives with a knock in the dead of night. When I first opened my eyes, all I could perceive was the heavy blanket of darkness enveloping me. My mind struggled to piece together the last memories before this abrupt awakening, but they were obscured, as if hidden behind a fogged glass. I remembered a gathering with friends, laughter echoing in a warmly lit room, and then a sharp, sudden dizziness. Now here I was, lying on a cold, damp concrete floor, enveloped by an inky abyss that seemed to press against my skin. Panic clawed at my chest as I tried to move, my limbs heavy and uncooperative. The air was thick, filled with a musty odor that suggested this basement, wherever it was, hadn't seen the light of day in a long time. Fumbling in the dark, my hands found a wall, and using it as a guide, I slowly pushed myself to my feet. The faint sound of dripping water was the only noise that punctuated the silence, each drop a harsh reminder of the depth of my isolation. I shuffled forward with trepidation, my outstretched hands eventually finding the cold metal of a door handle. Relief surged through me until I tried turning it and found it locked from the other side. Desperation surged, and I pounded on the door, my shouts for help dissolving into the void beyond. My throat raw, I retreated into the darkness again, my mind racing for any solution. As hours, or perhaps days, time was a slippery concept in this place, passed, I explored the edges of my prison, my hands mapping out the confines of the small space. In one corner, I found an assortment of old, rusted tools and rags. In another, A pile of empty food cans suggested someone had once prepared this place for long-term use. With a growing sense of dread, I realized this wasn't an accident. I had been brought here, left in the shadows to be forgotten. By whom, I couldn't say. The memory of that night was still too blurred, the faces of my friends now mingling with potential foes in my mind. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. I rationed the stale water dripping from a leaky pipe, each sip metallic and sharp on my tongue. Sleep was a fleeting, restless state, filled with nightmares of being chased deeper into an endless darkness. Then came the sound that changed everything, a key turning in the lock. The door creaked open, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. My heart leaped to my throat, hope mingling with fear. I pressed myself against the wall, peering into the light, too blinded to see the face of my visitor. A figure stepped inside, the door closing with a thud behind them. They moved with a familiarity that chilled me to the bone. As my eyes adjusted, the figure came into focus, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was one of my friends from the party, the one whose laughter had filled the room, whose hand had clutched mine as I stumbled from dizziness. Why? I managed to choke out, my voice a raspy whisper. They stepped closer, and in the dim light from the corridor outside, I saw no remorse, only a cold, calculated gaze. "You knew too much," they murmured almost apologetically. "It's just easier this way." As they advanced, I scrambled backward, but the small room offered no escape. My back hit the wall, the cold seeping through my clothes. They were upon me then, their hands cold and strong as they pushed me to the ground. The last thing I saw was the door swinging closed, the sliver of light vanishing. I was alone again in the darkness, my breath shallow, my body too weak to fight. The sound of their footsteps faded, leaving me with the echo of the door locking once more. I lay there in the darkness, understanding that my disappearance would likely remain a mystery. My friend, my betrayer, would return to the world above, their secret safe, their hands washed clean. As for me, I was left to vanish, a shadow swallowed by the depths of an unyielding darkness. I've always sought the serenity of the forest, the whisper of leaves, and the solace of solitude far from the clamor of city life. It was my sanctuary, a place to clear my head and escape the confines of routine. That day was no different, or so I thought as I ventured into the depths of Greenwood Forest, my favorite haunt, a camera slung over my shoulder, ready to capture the early signs of autumn. The path was familiar, worn by my many previous visits, leading deeper into the heart of the woods. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting mottled shadows on the forest floor. Birds chirped overhead, a soothing melody that accompanied my steps. Engrossed in the beauty surrounding me, I paid little heed to the path beneath my feet. As the afternoon waned, a cool breeze ushered in clouds that masked the sun, dimming the vibrant hues of the forest and bringing an unseasonable chill. I pulled my jacket tighter and decided it was time to head back before the light failed entirely. I turned around, retracing my steps, but something felt off. The path, which should have led me straight back to the forest's edge, seemed to curve more than I remembered. The trees, once familiar markers of my journey, now stood like strangers, their gnarled branches casting eerie, elongated shadows that twisted and writhed on the ground. With a growing unease, I quickened my pace, the rustling of leaves underfoot sounding louder in the growing silence. An hour passed, then two, and a creeping dread settled over me as I recognized a particular bent oak tree, its branches hanging like the weary arms of a ghost. It was the same tree I had passed earlier, only now it was on my left, where before it had been on my right. Panic clawed at my chest. I was walking in circles, each step forward somehow looping me back to where I'd begun. The forest, my haven of peace, had become a labyrinth with no exit. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped, my breath visible in the chilling air. My steps became desperate, erratic, as I tried new paths, only to find myself facing the same landmarks over and over again. Night enveloped the forest completely, the once comforting rustle of leaves now a sinister whisper around me. My flashlight, a weak beam against the oppressive dark, flickered and died, leaving me blind in the heart of Greenwood. I stumbled, fell, and lay there, too exhausted to rise, the cold seeping into my bones. I realized then that the forest had changed, or perhaps it had always been this way, a living, breathing entity, watching me with unseen eyes, delighting in my panic and fear. The trees seemed to lean closer, their whispers louder, speaking a language I could not understand but felt deep in my soul. I lay on the forest floor, the ground beneath me as unyielding as my fate. The realization dawned on me that I would never leave Greenwood. The forest had claimed me, ensnared me in its endless loop. I was a part of it now, another lost soul wandering its twisted paths. As the cold embraced me, the last of my strength ebbing away, I saw figures moving between the trees, shadows darker than the night. They circled, drawing closer, their forms indistinct but palpably intent. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My body, my voice, even my fear, seemed to belong to the forest now. And so I remained, another whisper among the trees, a warning left unheeded by those who would walk the paths of Greenwood Forest. Forever lost, forever walking in a circle that had no beginning and no end, in the middle of a forest that never lets go. The sky was already growling when I left my small lakeside cabin for a late evening walk, something I regretted as soon as the first raindrops fell. They were thick and heavy, a prelude to the storm that had been threatening all day. Within minutes, the heavens opened, and a torrential downpour blurred the landscape into watercolor smudges. Thunder boomed, echoing across the lake, and I hurriedly sought refuge. The nearest shelter was an old boathouse at the water's edge, its wood weathered from years of neglect. It wasn't much, but it would keep me dry until the storm passed. As I pushed open the door, it creaked loudly, a sound swallowed by the roar of the wind. Inside, the air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and stagnant water. I fumbled in my pocket for a flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness to reveal canoes and fishing gear piled haphazardly. I settled on a worn wooden bench near the entrance, wrapping my jacket tighter around me as the temperature dropped. Lightning flashed, illuminating the boathouse in brief, stark flashes. In one of these bursts of light, I thought I saw the outline of a figure standing at the far end of the boathouse. I blinked, convincing myself it was just shadows playing tricks on me. But then, in the space between thunderclaps, I heard it. A soft shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging across the floor. "Hello?" My voice sounded small and shaky against the storm's wail. No answer came, only the wind howling through the cracks in the boathouse walls. I pointed my flashlight toward the back of the boathouse, my hand trembling. The light beam settled on an old tarp covering something large. As I watched, the tarp lifted slightly, as if breathing. I stood up, heart pounding, torn between running out into the storm and staying where I might not be alone. My mind raced with every horror story I'd ever heard about shadowy figures and stormy nights. Gathering my courage, I moved closer, the floorboards creaking under my weight. Just as I reached for the tarp, a flash of lightning lit up the entire boathouse, and I saw what was under the tarp. Not a thing, but a person, huddled and shivering. The person looked up, their face pale and eyes wide with terror, mirroring my own. It was a woman, drenched and scared. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Relief washed over me, mixed with embarrassment. "I'm not gonna hurt you," I assured her. "I thought I was alone. I just came in here to escape the storm." She nodded, pulling the tarp back over her as a makeshift blanket. We sat in silence, listening to the rain beat down on the roof, both too shaken to speak. Eventually, the storm passed, and the rain slowed to a drizzle. I offered to walk the woman back to town, but she shook her head, insisting she had to stay. "Why?" I asked. She didn't answer, just turned away, looking back out into the night. Unease settled over me again as I left the boathouse, her silhouette a dark shape against the gray morning. When I reached my cabin, curiosity got the better of me. I called the local sheriff's office, asking if they knew anyone living in the boathouse. The line was silent for a moment before the sheriff replied, his voice grave. "No one's lived there for years, not since the accident. A couple took shelter there during a storm, much like tonight. Only one came out alive. They say she still waits there for someone to come back for her." Chills ran down my spine as I peered out my window toward the boathouse, now just a silhouette against the brightening sky. Had I imagined her? Or had the storm brought me more than just shelter? Had it brought me a glimpse of something or someone trapped between this world and the next? I never went back to the boathouse, unable to shake the feeling that I hadn't been alone, and perhaps had never been meant to find shelter there at all. I had always been drawn to the past, so when I stumbled upon the Edgewater Hotel, a crumbling relic perched precariously on the cliff's edge overlooking the sea, it felt like fate. The hotel was a vestige of Victorian grandeur, its halls echoing with the whispers of a bygone era. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a stooped posture and a permanent frown, handed me the key to room 413, advising me it was their most special room. As I ascended the narrow, creaking stairs to the 4th floor, the air grew colder, a stark contrast to the warmth of the summer day outside. The corridor was dimly lit, the wallpaper peeling like aged skin, revealing the brittle bones of the plaster beneath. Room 413 was at the end of the hall, isolated and silent. The door groaned on its hinges as I pushed it open. The room was shrouded in shadows, the heavy drapes drawn tight against the afternoon sun. As my eyes adjusted, I saw it, sitting in a high-backed armchair by the window, a porcelain doll in a faded lace dress. Its hair was matted, and one eye was missing, leaving an empty socket that seemed to watch me as I moved about the room. Something about the doll unsettled me, an inexplicable dread that settled in the pit of my stomach. Yet, fascinated by its eerie presence, I left it untouched, a silent sentinel watching over the room. That night, the wind howled against the cliffs, a mournful lament that seeped through the cracks in the windows. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the doll's remaining eye staring into mine, its gaze penetrating and accusing. Unable to sleep, I rose from bed and approached the doll. Up close, I could see the fine cracks webbing its porcelain face like delicate veins. On impulse, I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against its cold, smooth cheek. As soon as I touched it, the room grew colder, the air thick with the scent of the sea. The doll's eye seemed to flicker, and I recoiled in horror, stumbling back to bed where I lay wide awake until dawn. The next day, driven by a mix of terror and curiosity, I asked the receptionist about the doll. Her face paled at my description, her hands trembling as she clasped them tightly in front of her. "That room, we don't usually rent it out," she confessed, her voice a whisper. "The doll belonged to a little girl who stayed here with her family long ago. They found her one stormy night, lifeless with the doll clutched in her arms. They say she never left, and neither did the doll." Chilled by her story, I resolved to leave the hotel at once. But when I returned to my room to pack my things, the atmosphere had shifted. The air was stifling, heavy with the smell of decay. The doll was no longer in the chair. Frantically, I searched the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I found it, eventually, sitting on my bed, its one good eye staring at the door as if waiting for me. Terrified, I grabbed the doll and threw it against the wall, watching as it shattered into pieces. A scream filled the room, so loud and so close I thought my ears would bleed. The temperature dropped, my breath visible in the air, and I felt small hands gripping my throat, choking the life out of me. I struggled, clawing at the invisible hands, my vision darkening. When I awoke, I was lying on the floor, the morning sun streaming through the window. The doll was back in the chair, whole, as if it had never been broken. Its eye was fixed on me, its gaze mocking. I fled the hotel that morning, leaving my belongings behind, but peace did not follow. At night, wherever I go, I hear her scream, feel those tiny hands around my throat. The doll haunts my dreams, its one-eyed stare a constant reminder of the Edgewater Hotel. I know now that I can never escape it. The doll, that room, and the ghost of the little girl are with me always, a part of me forever. The Edgewater Hotel may fade into obscurity, but its last guest and her doll will never check out. The road to my family's old cabin was long and winding, a narrow strip of asphalt that cut through dense, ancient woods. It had been years since I had visited, and memories of summer vacations and winter holidays filled my mind as I navigated the familiar route. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in deep shadows that seemed to dance in my headlights. The cabin was a relic from another era, built by my grandfather with his own hands. It stood isolated, miles from the nearest neighbor, a sanctuary from the chaos of modern life. I had come here seeking solace, a brief escape from the pressures of my job and the turmoil of a recent breakup. As I drove, the trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches forming a canopy overhead. The air grew colder, and a thick fog began to creep along the ground, snaking through the underbrush and obscuring the road ahead. I slowed my car, squinting through the windshield as visibility decreased. That's when I saw him, a child, standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. He looked no older than 10, with pale skin and dark, tangled hair. He wore tattered clothes that hung off his thin frame, and his eyes were wide, staring directly at me. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat as the car skidded to a stop mere feet from where he stood. For a moment, neither of us moved. The forest was silent, the only sound the low hum of my engine. I rolled down the window and called out to him, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, unmoving, his eyes locked onto mine. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting into my skin. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice echoing eerily in the stillness. The boy didn't answer. He simply turned and began to walk into the woods. Something about the way he moved sent a chill down my spine. It was as if he were gliding, his feet barely touching the ground. Despite every instinct screaming at me to get back in the car and drive away, I followed him. The fog thickened, wrapping around us like a shroud as we ventured deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer together, their twisted trunks and knotted roots creating a labyrinthine path. The boy moved swiftly, effortlessly, while I stumbled over hidden roots and rocks. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. I lost track of time as we walked. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. The boy never once looked back, his dark figure barely visible in the gloom. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, we emerged into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated cabin, much like my family's but older, more decayed. The windows were broken, the door hanging off its hinges. The boy stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. He said nothing, just pointed to the cabin. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread that washed over me, I felt compelled to enter. The inside of the cabin was as decrepit as the outside. Dust coated every surface, cobwebs draped from the ceiling like morbid decorations. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic. In the center of the room was a trapdoor. It was slightly ajar, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. The boy was gone, vanished as if he had never been there. I approached the trapdoor, my heart pounding in my chest. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around me. The steps creaked under my weight, each sound echoing in the confined space. At the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. On the floor was a circle of candles, their flames flickering weakly. In the center of the circle lay a small, worn journal. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I opened it. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting, detailing rituals and incantations, references to summoning and binding. The final entry sent a chill down my spine. "The child is the key. He will lead the way. Bind him and be free." As I read those words, a cold breeze swept through the room, snuffing out the candles. I was plunged into darkness, the air thick with an oppressive presence. I felt something brush against my arm, and I turned to find the boy standing beside me, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He reached out and took my hand, his grip ice cold. I tried to pull away, but his strength was far greater than any child's should be. He led me back up the stairs, back through the forest, and back to the road where my car sat waiting. As we emerged from the trees, I glanced back at the boy. His face twisted into a sinister smile, and in that moment I knew I had made a grave mistake. I yanked my hand free and ran to my car, fumbling with the keys in my panic. I drove away as fast as I could, the fog swallowing the road behind me. The cabin was still miles away, but I no longer cared. I just wanted to escape, to put as much distance between myself and that boy as possible. But as I sped down the road, I realized the fog wasn't lifting. The trees seemed to stretch on endlessly, the road looping back on itself. Panic set in as I recognized landmarks I had passed before, my headlights revealing the same twisted trees over and over again. The boy's face flashed in my mind, his eyes glowing, his smile widening. I was trapped, caught in a nightmarish loop with no escape. I drove for hours, days, time losing all meaning as the forest closed in around me. And now, as I write this, I can hear him outside, his footsteps soft on the gravel, his whispers seeping through the walls. The cabin is just ahead, and I know I can't avoid it any longer. The boy is the key, and I am bound to him, forever lost in the woods. If you find this, turn back. Don't follow the boy. Don't listen to the whispers. Once you're in, there's no way out. The office was deserted. Late nights had become a routine for me as deadlines loomed and my workload piled up. The usual hum of conversation, the clatter of keyboards, and the ringing of phones had long since ceased, leaving only the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights and the occasional groan of the building settling. I was in the middle of reviewing a particularly dense report when I heard the elevator ding. It was an unexpected sound in the silence, and I glanced up, frowning. The elevator was at the far end of the hall, and there was no reason for anyone else to be here at this hour. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood up, peering down the dimly lit corridor. The elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss. There was nobody there, just an empty metal box, its interior lights casting a sterile glow on the tiled floor. I waited for a moment, expecting someone to step out or perhaps realizing they had arrived at the wrong floor, but no one appeared. With a sigh, I returned to my desk, dismissing the incident as a glitch or a case of someone calling the elevator and deciding against the trip. The report was still waiting, and I had no time for distractions. But as I settled back into my chair, the lights flickered. A shiver ran down my spine. The building's electricity was usually stable, and such occurrences were rare. I shook it off, focusing on the pages in front of me. Minutes passed, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The air seemed heavier, the silence more oppressive. Then I heard it. Footsteps, soft, measured, and coming from the direction of the elevator. I froze, listening intently. The steps drew closer, echoing in the empty hall. I strained my ears, trying to discern if it was someone from security doing their rounds, but the steps were too deliberate, too slow. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if the unseen visitor had been startled by my voice. I stood up again, my heart pounding, and walked toward the hall. As I approached the corner that led to the elevator, the lights flickered again, plunging the hall into brief darkness. When the light returned, I saw a shadow at the far end, near the elevator. It was faint, indistinct, and seemed to waver as if caught between the light and darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded. Trying to keep the tremor out of my voice, there was no response. The shadow remained, unmoving. I took a step closer, and the shadow vanished, dissipating like smoke. I stopped in my tracks, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned to head back to my office, but then the sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. It was my desk phone. I hurried back, grateful for the distraction. The caller ID was blank, displaying no number. I hesitated for a moment before picking up the receiver. "Hello?" Silence greeted me. Then a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, insistent. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice cracking. The whispering continued, growing more frantic. I slammed the receiver down, my hands shaking. The lights flickered once more, and this time they didn't come back on. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the pale glow of my computer screen. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, switching on the flashlight. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar surroundings of my office. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's just a power outage," I told myself, though I didn't quite believe it. I decided to make my way to the stairwell and leave. The elevator was out of the question. As I moved toward the door, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were faster, more erratic. They seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding me. I burst into the hall, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam caught glimpses of movement, shadows darting just out of sight. I ran, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. The stairwell was just ahead, a door marked with an exit sign that glowed faintly in the dark. I reached the door and yanked it open, plunging into the stairwell. The sound of the door slamming shut behind me echoed ominously. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my breath ragged, heart pounding. The footsteps followed, relentless and close. I reached the ground floor and shoved open the door to the lobby. The security desk was empty, the main entrance looming just a few steps away. I sprinted toward it, my only thought to escape this nightmare. But as I reached the doors, they refused to budge. Locked. I pounded on the glass, shouting for help, but there was no one outside, no one to hear me. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping the lobby. The elevator doors were open again, and this time something was emerging. It was a figure, indistinct and shrouded in darkness, its form flickering like a faulty signal. I backed away, pressing myself against the glass doors. The figure advanced, its movements jerky and unnatural. It reached out, and I felt an icy chill wash over me. The flashlight flickered, then died, plunging me into complete darkness. In the pitch black, I could feel it drawing closer, the cold intensifying. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispering returned, louder now, surrounding me, filling my mind with incomprehensible words. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. And then everything went silent. The cold receded, the whispers faded. I was alone in the dark, the oppressive presence gone. I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up dimly. I used it to navigate back to the stairwell, my mind numb with fear. As I climbed the stairs back to my office, the building remained silent. The oppressive feeling had lifted, but the fear lingered. I reached my office and found the lights had returned, my computer screen displaying the report I had been working on. It was as if nothing had happened. I grabbed my things and left as quickly as I could, not daring to look back. As I drove home, the events replayed in my mind, a surreal nightmare that I couldn't shake. I never worked late again, and I never spoke of what happened that night. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the elevator ding in my mind, the footsteps echoing in the hall. And I know that whatever it was, it's still there, waiting, watching, ready to return. The night had grown cold and still, a silence so deep it felt tangible. I was ensconced in my small apartment, a sanctuary of sorts, surrounded by the familiar trappings of my life. The world outside was a void, a dark expanse beyond my windows. I had spent the evening working on a project, the blue light of my computer screen casting an eerie glow around the room. Eventually, weariness set in, and I decided to call it a night. I went through my usual routine, brushing my teeth, changing into my pajamas, and double-checking that the doors and windows were locked. Satisfied, I turned off the lights and slipped under the covers, the weight of the blankets providing a comforting barrier between me and the night. My eyes grew heavy, and soon I was drifting into a fitful sleep. Sometime later, I was yanked from my dreams by a faint noise. At first, I thought it was part of my dreamscape, but as consciousness returned, I realized it was real. I lay still, my senses sharpening as I tried to identify the sound. It was the low hum of a television, accompanied by the murmur of indistinct voices. Confusion washed over me. I hadn't left the TV on. Heart pounding, I sat up and looked toward the living room. A soft, flickering light was spilling into the hallway, casting dancing shadows on the walls. I slid out of bed and crept toward the source, each step tentative and laden with unease. As I entered the living room, I saw the TV was indeed on. It displayed static, the gray and white specks swirling in a chaotic dance. The sound was an unsettling white noise, punctuated by snippets of garbled speech. I grabbed the remote from the coffee table and pressed the power button, but nothing happened. I tried again, frustration and fear mingling as the TV continued its maddening display. I approached the TV and manually pressed the power button, relieved when the screen finally went dark. The room was silent once more, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unsettling energy. I stood there for a moment, heart still racing, before convincing myself it was just a glitch, an electronic hiccup. I returned to bed, hoping to reclaim the comfort of sleep. Hours later, I was again awakened by the same noise. My eyes snapped open, and dread pooled in my stomach. The TV was on again, the static and whispers filling the room with an oppressive presence. I threw off the covers and stormed into the living room, determined to end this once and for all. As I reached for the power button, the screen abruptly changed. A distorted face filled the screen, eyes wide and mouth moving as if speaking, but the sound remained a garbled mess. The image flickered and warped, the features twisting in a grotesque mimicry of speech. I stumbled back, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. I hit the power button again, and this time the screen went black instantly. Shaken, I checked the plugs and connections, ensuring everything was secure. Nothing seemed amiss, but the sense of unease persisted. I returned to bed, my mind racing with thoughts of faulty wiring and crossed signals. Sleep was elusive, and when I finally did drift off, my dreams were haunted by that twisted face. For several nights, the TV remained silent, and I began to relax, believing the strange occurrences were over. But one night, the familiar hum returned, louder and more insistent than before. This time, the TV was displaying a series of images, dark, shadowy figures moving through what appeared to be my apartment. The angle was disorienting, as if filmed from impossible perspectives. Fear gripped me as I watched the figures glide soundlessly through my home. They paused at my bedroom door, and one by one, they turned to look directly at the camera. Their faces were obscured, features lost in the shadows, but their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. I felt a chill run down my spine, a cold dread that settled deep in my bones. I wanted to turn away, to flee, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes from the screen. The figures began to move again, their motions fluid and eerie. They slipped through the door and into my bedroom. I whipped around, expecting to see them standing there, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the TV, the screen was dark, the room once again silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. It had to be a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. I pinched myself, the sharp pain confirming I was awake. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains set my nerves on edge. I avoided the living room, fearing what the TV might show me next. I considered staying with a friend or even checking into a hotel, but a stubborn part of me refused to be driven from my own home. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard the TV turn on again. This time, the sound was different, a rhythmic thumping, like footsteps, interspersed with that same garbled whispering. I knew I had to confront it, to end this torment once and for all. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the living room. The screen was filled with static, but the images were faintly visible behind it. I could see my apartment, the camera's perspective drifting slowly through the rooms. My heart stopped as the view focused on the living room, and I realized the camera was moving toward me. I turned the flashlight on, its beam cutting through the darkness, but nothing was there. The room was empty, save for me and the TV. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The TV's glow seemed to intensify, the images growing clearer. I saw myself on the screen, standing in the living room, flashlight in hand. The perspective shifted, drawing closer to the screen me, until the camera was right behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Panic surged through me as I watched the screen. The figures reappeared, emerging from the shadows, their glowing eyes fixed on me. They surrounded the screen me, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. I felt their presence closing in, the air thickening with their cold energy. The screen me turned to face the camera, and I saw my own terrified expression. The figures reached out, their hands passing through the screen me and into the real me. I felt a searing cold spread through my body, rooting me to the spot. The whispers filled my mind, an incomprehensible chorus that drowned out my thoughts. Darkness swallowed the room, and I felt myself being pulled into the TV, into the static. The last thing I saw was the distorted face, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light, and then everything went black. I don't know how long I've been here, trapped in the static. The whispers are my only companions, their words still a mystery. I see the real world through the screen, but I can't reach it. I watch as others move into the apartment, oblivious to my presence. And every night, I wait for the TV to turn on, for the chance to reach out and be seen, hoping that someone will understand the whispers and set me free. But deep down, I know the truth. I'm part of the static now, forever trapped in the darkness, a ghost in the machine. And as the days turn to nights and the nights to days, I wait, knowing that one day the TV will turn on again and the cycle will continue. The house I inherited from my great aunt was a relic from another time, creaking with memories and histories best left forgotten. I moved in out of necessity, not desire, as my financial situation had taken a nosedive. The house was large and imposing, with an attic that seemed to breathe a life of its own. From the moment I stepped inside, I could sense a heavy presence hanging over the place, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. It started with the footsteps. The first night I was jolted awake by the sound of slow, deliberate steps above me. The attic, a place I had yet to explore, seemed to be the source. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling, the way old houses often do. But the footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, a relentless, rhythmic tapping that gnawed at my nerves. During the day, the house was eerily silent, as if it was waiting for nightfall to come alive. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the footsteps grew louder, more insistent, each night a little worse than the last. I could no longer sleep, my nights filled with a dread that seeped into my bones. One evening, I gathered enough courage to venture into the attic. The door was stiff, as if it hadn't been opened in years. I pushed it open, the hinges screaming in protest, and climbed the rickety stairs. The attic was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with old furniture covered in white sheets and boxes stacked haphazardly. It felt colder up there, a chill that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I searched for any sign of an intruder but found nothing. The footsteps had stopped the moment I opened the door, as if whatever was causing them knew I was coming. Unease prickled my skin, and I left the attic, closing the door behind me, hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The footsteps returned, now accompanied by faint whispers. At first, they were too soft to make out, but as the nights wore on, I could hear them more clearly. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, a guttural, harsh tongue that sent shivers down my spine. I tried playing music, turning on all the lights, anything to drown out the sound, but nothing worked. One night, the whispers became a scream, a blood-curdling wail that echoed through the house. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding, and decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat, determined to confront whatever was haunting me. As I reached the attic door, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath came out in frosty puffs, and the door seemed to resist my touch. I forced it open, the scream cutting off abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. The flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but the same dusty clutter. Then I saw it. In the corner, half hidden by a sheet, stood a figure. It was gaunt and twisted, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It stared at me, unblinking, as if assessing my very soul. I couldn't move, paralyzed by fear, as it began to shuffle toward me. Its steps were the same ones I had heard night after night, that slow, deliberate pacing. I swung the bat, but it passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The figure continued to advance, its eyes locking onto mine. Whispers filled the room, louder now, more insistent, and I could finally understand their meaning. Join us. I stumbled backward, dropping the flashlight. Darkness enveloped me, and I felt a cold hand grasp my wrist. Panic surged through me as I tried to wrench free, but the grip was ironclad. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and I felt myself being pulled forward toward the figure. In a final, desperate act, I screamed for help, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The last thing I saw was the figure's face, twisted into a grotesque semblance of a smile, as it pulled me into the shadows. I awoke in the attic alone, the house silent once more. But I knew something had changed. I could feel it in my very being, a coldness that had settled into my bones. I was no longer alone in that house. The footsteps, the whispers, they were gone, but I could feel the presence lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. I tried to leave, to escape the house and whatever curse it held, but the doors wouldn't open, the windows wouldn't budge. I was trapped, a prisoner in my own home. The footsteps returned, but now they were my own, pacing the floors, searching for a way out. The whispers followed, and I understood them perfectly now. They spoke of an eternity of torment, of being bound to the house forever. And as the days turned into nights, I felt myself slipping away, becoming part of the darkness that haunted the house. The last shred of my humanity was stripped away the night I found myself standing at the attic door, hand on the knob, a smile twisting my lips. I opened the door, feeling the darkness welcome me, embrace me. I was home. And now, when the night falls and the house grows silent, if you listen closely, you can hear the footsteps in the attic. They are mine, forever pacing, forever trapped, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to join me. I've always been fascinated by antiques, so when I inherited my grandmother's old, ornate mirror, I was thrilled. It was a beautiful gilded piece that seemed to hold a million stories within its reflective surface. I hung it in my living room, a focal point that drew the eye of anyone who visited. But there was something odd about the mirror. At first, I noticed it only in passing, a flicker of movement, as if someone were standing just at the edge of my vision. I chalked it up to the light playing tricks, the way old mirrors sometimes do. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more persistent as the days passed. One evening I was home alone, reading by the fireplace, when I heard a faint whisper. "Look," it seemed to say. I glanced up, and in the reflection of the mirror, I saw my friend, Sarah. She was smiling, her familiar, comforting smile. But Sarah wasn't due to come over until the next day. "Sarah?" I called out, turning around, but there was no one in the room with me. When I looked back at the mirror, she was still there, only she wasn't moving. Her image was perfectly still, like a photograph. I approached the mirror slowly, a cold knot forming in my stomach. As I stood in front of it, Sarah's image began to change. Her smile twisted into a grimace, her eyes hollowing out. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a chilling echo that didn't sound like her at all. Panicked, I reached for the phone to call her, but as I dialed her number, I glanced back at the mirror. The room behind my reflection was shifting, darkening, as if night had fallen within the glass. Sarah's form began to fade, dissolving into the shadows that now filled the mirror's world. The phone rang once, twice, then Sarah picked up. "Hey, I just got home. Everything okay?" she said, her voice bright and clear, unmistakably real and unmistakably alive. "I just saw you in the mirror. You were asking for help," I stammered, unable to understand how that could be when she sounded perfectly fine. "What are you talking about? I'm at home. Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, concern edging her words. I turned back to the mirror. The room reflected there was my own living room again, bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace. Sarah's image was gone, as if it had never been there. Shaken, I assured her I must have imagined it all, and we said our goodbyes. But after that night, the mirror never seemed the same. I would catch glimpses of people I knew, calling out to me silently from the other side. Each time I would check on them, call them, find them perfectly fine. I began to research, digging through old records and books about the mirror. I discovered it had belonged not just to my grandmother, but to many others before her, each owner having reported strange occurrences, visions in the glass that drove them to the brink of madness. The mirror, it seemed, had a history darker than I could have imagined. One night, unable to sleep, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion, I stood before the mirror. I stared into my own eyes, looking for answers, for a sign. Slowly, the room behind my reflection changed, the walls darkening, the light dimming. This time, it was my face in the mirror that changed. I watched in horror as my reflection contorted, a silent scream stretching across my face. I tried to turn away, to flee, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my eyes locked with those of my twisted reflection. And then I felt it, a pull, as if cold hands were dragging me forward, into the dark world within the mirror. They found the mirror smashed when they came to check on me, pieces of glass scattered across the living room floor. But of me, there was no sign, gone, without a trace, except for the fragments of a once beautiful, now shattered mirror, each piece holding a screaming, silent reflection of my face. forever caught in the grip of the mirror's dark embrace. Every night, as the city fell quiet and the last flickers of twilight faded into darkness, I walked the desolate streets of my neighborhood, a ritual to clear my mind and escape the confines of my small, cluttered apartment. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional distant sound of a car or the rustling of trees in the breeze. It was during one of these nightly walks that I first saw her. She stood at the far end of the park that bordered my street, motionless, facing away from me. There was something unsettling about her posture, the way she seemed both present and utterly absent. Curiosity overcame my initial hesitation, and I approached her, my footsteps soft on the grass. As I drew closer, she turned slowly to face me. My heart stopped. Where her face should have been, there was nothing. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a smooth expanse of skin. A chill ran down my spine, but before I could move or speak, she vanished, as if swallowed by the night itself. Each night thereafter, I saw her again, always in the same spot, always turning to reveal her faceless visage, and always disappearing before I could react. I became obsessed, my nightly walks consumed by the need to see her, to understand what she was. I stopped sleeping, my days blurring into nights, every moment dominated by thoughts of her. Driven by a desperate need to prove I wasn't losing my mind, I brought a camera one night, determined to capture her image. As I approached her usual spot, there she was, her back to me. I raised the camera, my hands trembling, and took a photo. She began to turn, and I braced myself for the sight of her faceless head, but she vanished before completing the turn, leaving me once again alone in the silent park. I rushed home, eager to see if the photo had captured anything. There was an image of her, indeed, standing in the park, but it was blurry, her figure indistinct. I printed the photo, my gaze drawn to the spot where her face should be. As I stared, the ink began to run inexplicably, blurring the image further until it was nothing but a smudge. Night after night I returned, each encounter leaving me more drained, more obsessed, more detached from the world around me. My friends and family grew concerned, but I pushed them away, my thoughts consumed entirely by the woman without a face. Then one night, everything changed. As usual, she stood in the park, but this time, when she turned, there was a face where none had been before. But it wasn't just any face, it was mine. My own eyes stared back at me, hollow and devoid of emotion, on her head. Horrified, I stepped back, stumbling, falling to the ground. She advanced toward me, her movements eerie and unnatural. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond, paralyzed by fear and confusion. She leaned down, her face inches from mine, and I felt an icy coldness emanating from her. As her hand reached out to touch my cheek, the world around me began to fade. The park, the streetlights, the city itself dissolving into darkness. All that remained were her eyes, my eyes, filled with an unspeakable sadness that seemed to consume everything. When I awoke, it was daytime, and I was lying in the park, the city bustling around me as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. I felt empty, hollow, as if part of me had been taken. I rushed home to look in the mirror, needing to see myself, to confirm I was still real. But the reflection that met me was not my own. It was her, the woman without a face, now with my face. I reached up to touch my face, but my hands met only smooth skin where my features should have been. In horror, I realized the truth. She had taken my face, my identity, my very being. Now I wander the streets at night, faceless, searching for her, hoping to reclaim what was stolen from me. But night after night, I find nothing but my own hollow reflection in the darkened windows of the city, a reminder of what I once was and can never be again. I had always dreamed of owning a quaint little house in the countryside, away from the relentless noise of city life. When I finally found an old but charming house nestled on the edge of a sleepy town, it felt like destiny. The house was perfect, or so I thought, until I stumbled upon the locked door to the basement. My realtor had casually mentioned that the previous owner had lost the key and never bothered to replace it, advising me to simply have a locksmith come in. The idea of an unexplored part of my new home intrigued me, but the first few weeks were consumed with unpacking and setting up, pushing thoughts of the basement aside. As days turned into weeks, a curiosity about what lay behind the locked door began to gnaw at me. One chilly evening, driven by a mix of impatience and intrigue, I decided it was time to see what was being kept hidden. Armed with a set of makeshift lock-picking tools I'd purchased online, I set to work on the old, rusted padlock. After several frustrating attempts, the lock clicked open. A rush of cold, stale air greeted me as I slowly pushed the door open. The basement was steeped in darkness. I fumbled for the light switch, but found none, so I used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the narrow staircase that descended into the gloom. As I made my way down, the air grew colder and a musty, earthy smell enveloped me. The basement was surprisingly vast and filled with remnants from the past. Old furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly, and old newspapers that littered the floor. At the far end of the basement, I noticed a peculiar, ornately carved door that seemed out of place in the otherwise mundane space. Drawn by an inexplicable pull, I approached it, only to find this door locked as well. No amount of picking could open it, and no key was in sight. That night, I lay in bed, my thoughts fixated on the mysterious door. The house was silent, eerily so, and it wasn't long before I drifted into a restless sleep. I dreamed of the door swinging open to reveal a blinding light and shadows that whispered in a language I couldn't understand. The next morning, I found myself standing by the basement door, unsure how I got there. Dismissing it as sleepwalking, a new, unnerving habit I attributed to the stress of the move, I decided to ignore the basement and its mysteries. But night after night, I found myself drawn back, waking at the foot of the basement stairs, each time a step closer to the mysterious door. Driven by a need for answers and fearing for my sanity, I called a locksmith. He arrived with an air of skepticism, but soon his casual demeanor changed as his attempts to open the door failed one after another. His final words chilled me to the bone. It's like something on the other side is holding it shut. That night, the dream changed. The door opened, and instead of light, an abyssal darkness reached out, pulling me into its depths. I woke screaming, drenched in sweat, at the foot of the door in the basement. Days passed, and I became consumed with opening the door. I stopped eating, stopped leaving the house, my every moment consumed by the need to see what lay beyond. One evening, as the sun set and the house fell into shadow, the air around me grew icy. The door creaked open. Inside was not a room, but a vast, endless void. Whispers filled the air, calling me forward. I stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind me. Darkness enveloped me, the whispers growing louder, more demanding. They wanted something I couldn't give, something I didn't understand. Back in the world I had left, the house remained silent, a beacon of solitude in the sleepy town. Neighbors spoke of the newcomer who vanished without a trace, the house sitting empty, waiting. The door to the basement firmly locked, as if it had never been opened. Ever since I moved into my small, somewhat decrepit apartment on the edge of town, I'd noticed my neighbor across the street, an odd, solitary figure who would stand at his window at night, staring directly into mine. At first I thought little of it, dismissing it as the quirk of an eccentric old man, perhaps lonely, seeking some semblance of human connection. But as the days turned into weeks, his unblinking, unwavering gaze began to unsettle me. Each night, as darkness fell and the street lamps cast eerie shadows through my curtains, I would see him there. He was always perfectly still, his silhouette framed against the dim light of his living room. I tried closing my curtains, but the small gaps where the fabric didn't quite meet became windows of torment through which I could feel his eyes on me, intense and unyielding. I began to lose sleep, the constant sense of being watched gnawing at my sanity. My days became a blur of exhaustion and paranoia. I started to wonder if he ever moved, if he ever slept. Was he watching me all the time, even when I couldn't see him? Driven by a mix of fear and desperation, I decided to confront him. One evening, I mustered all my courage and crossed the street. His front door was slightly ajar, which struck me as odd, but I pushed it open and stepped inside. The house was dim and silent, dust motes dancing in the slivers of light that escaped through closed blinds. "Hello?" My voice sounded foreign in the stillness. There was no response, only the echo of my own words bouncing back at me. I walked toward the living room, the place from where he always watched. There he was, standing by the window, just as I had seen him night after night. I approached him slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. "Why are you watching me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. I reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. It was then I realized he was not a man but a remarkably lifelike mannequin, dressed in old, faded clothes, positioned to perpetually stare out the window at my apartment. I recoiled in horror, the implications of my discovery sending chills down my spine. If he wasn't the one watching, then who was? My eyes scanned the room, and that's when I noticed the real eyes, human eyes, peering at me from the dark corners of the room. The watcher had been watching me, using the mannequin as a decoy. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in the safety of my apartment. I locked the doors and windows, but the sense of being watched never left me. Night after night, I would see movement at his window, shadows shifting, hints of someone or something lurking behind the lifeless figure. The constant surveillance drove me to the brink. I kept my curtains permanently closed, taped the gaps, but the feeling of eyes on me persisted, an unshakable terror that consumed my life. One night, unable to endure the torment any longer, I decided to leave. But as I packed my things, a paralyzing realization dawned on me. The eyes, the presence I felt, it wasn't coming from across the street. It was coming from inside my apartment, from behind the mirrors, from the walls, from the shadows that had grown ever darker since I moved in. I understood then that I would never escape. My apartment, the building, perhaps the entire street, was alive with watchers, unseen beings that had claimed me as their own. Now, I stand at my window, staring out just as he did, my mind no longer my own. I watch and I wait, trapped in an endless night, a part of the darkness I once feared. When I first opened my eyes, the harsh, sterile light above me was blinding. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of my surroundings. The unmistakable smell of antiseptic and the faint hum of machinery told me I was in a hospital. My head pounded, and a dull ache radiated through my body as I tried to sit up. "Hello?" My voice echoed weakly in the empty room. There was no response. I glanced around, the room eerily still. The white sheets on my bed were crisp and clean, and the medical equipment beside me hummed softly, but there were no doctors, no nurses, no other patients. A growing sense of unease gnawed at me as I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, my legs trembling under my weight. I clutched the IV stand for support and took a tentative step forward. The room was painfully quiet, the only sound my labored breathing. I made my way to the door and pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The hallway stretched out before me, long and dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights casting ominous shadows on the walls. I called out again, my voice swallowed by the empty corridor. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Again, there was no response. I shuffled forward, my footsteps echoing loudly in the deserted hallway. Each door I passed was closed, and a sense of dread built with each step. Something was very wrong. Hospitals are never this empty, this silent. At the end of the hall, I saw a nurse's station. Hope flared briefly as I hurried toward it, but when I rounded the corner, I found it abandoned. The computer screens were dark, and papers were scattered haphazardly across the desk. It was as if everyone had left in a hurry. My heart pounded in my chest as I rifled through the papers, searching for any clue as to what had happened. Amidst the chaos, I found a patient chart with my name on it. My hands trembled as I read the details. Admitted 3 days ago, severe head trauma, condition stable. But there was no discharge date, no indication that I was supposed to be alone. A sudden, loud crash echoed down the hallway, making me jump. It sounded like it came from one of the rooms nearby. I hesitated, fear rooting me to the spot, but curiosity and the desperate need for answers pushed me forward. I followed the sound to a room halfway down the hall. The door was ajar, and as I approached, I could hear the faint sound of whispering. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the flickering hallway lights behind me. I squinted, trying to see into the shadows, when a figure suddenly darted out of the darkness and grabbed my arm. I screamed, stumbling back into the hallway. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a gaunt, disheveled man in a hospital gown. His eyes were wide with terror, and his grip on my arm was painfully tight. "You have to get out of here," he whispered urgently. "They're coming for us." Before I could respond, he let go and bolted down the hall, disappearing around a corner. My heart raced as I stood there, trying to make sense of his words. Who was coming? What was he talking about? Summoning my courage, I decided to follow him. Maybe he knew a way out. As I turned the corner, I saw a set of double doors marked "Exit" at the far end of the hallway. Relief washed over me as I hurried toward them, but my relief was short-lived. The doors were locked, a heavy chain and padlock securing them shut. Desperation clawed at me as I banged on the doors, hoping someone outside might hear me. But the silence that followed was deafening. I was trapped. I turned to retrace my steps, my mind racing with possibilities. There had to be another way out. But as I made my way back down the hallway, I noticed something strange. The doors to the rooms I had passed earlier were now open, and the whispering had returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls. Fear gripped me as I quickened my pace, the whispering growing louder with each step. It seemed to be coming from all around me, a chorus of voices speaking in hushed, frantic tones. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but their urgency was unmistakable. I rounded a corner and froze. The hallway ahead was filled with shadowy figures, their faces obscured by darkness. They stood silently, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Panic surged through me as I backed away, but the figures began to move, slowly advancing toward me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging me to flee. I darted down another hallway, hoping to find an open door, a window, anything that could be an escape route. But every turn led me deeper into the labyrinthine hospital, the layout seeming to shift and change around me. Finally, I burst into a large, open room filled with rows of empty hospital beds. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I collapsed onto one of the beds, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. That's when I saw her. A young girl, no older than 10, standing at the far end of the room. She wore a simple white dress, and her eyes were wide with a mix of fear and sadness. She raised a trembling hand and pointed to something behind me. I turned slowly, my heart sinking as I saw what she was pointing at. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. It moved toward me with a slow, deliberate grace, and as it drew closer, I could feel a cold, suffocating presence enveloping me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure reached out, its hand closing around my throat, and everything went black. When I awoke, I was back in my hospital bed, the sterile light flickering above me. The room was empty, and the air was still. My body ached, and my throat was sore, as if I had been screaming. I glanced around, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Was it all a dream, a hallucination brought on by my injuries? But as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it again, the soft, insistent whispering echoing through the empty halls. I knew then that I was not alone, and that whatever haunted this hospital was far from done with me. The light flickered once more and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me, suffocating me. I closed my eyes, knowing that there would be no escape, no waking from this nightmare. And then I felt it, a cold, clammy hand closing around my wrist, pulling me deeper into the darkness. The last thing I heard was the whispering, a chorus of voices welcoming me to the void where the light could never reach. I had always prided myself on my family's lake house. It was an old, charming cabin nestled in the heart of a thick forest, right by the edge of a crystal-clear lake. My friends had heard me talk about it so often, and finally, I decided to invite them up for a weekend getaway. I couldn't wait to share the tranquility and beauty of the place with them. We set off on a Friday afternoon. My friends Jenna, Mark, and Alex packed into my car with laughter and excitement. The drive was scenic, and we arrived just as the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the lake and the surrounding trees. It was everything I had described to them and more. The air was crisp, and the sound of the water lapping gently against the shore was soothing. The first evening was perfect. We unpacked, settled in, and gathered around a campfire by the lake, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The stars above were brilliant, and the moon cast a silvery light over the water. It was idyllic. As the night deepened, a strange feeling settled over me. It was as if the forest was watching us, the trees whispering secrets in the wind. I brushed it off as a trick of my imagination, fueled by the eerie atmosphere of the night. We decided to call it a night and headed inside. The next morning, we spent the day hiking and swimming. The lake was cool and refreshing, and the forest trails were beautiful, filled with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every so often, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. That night, as we sat around the fire again, Jenna suddenly went quiet, her eyes fixed on something across the lake. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We all turned to look, but saw nothing unusual. "See what?" Mark asked, trying to keep his tone light. "A woman," Jenna said, her voice barely audible. She was standing on the other side of the lake, wearing a long white dress. We laughed it off, attributing it to shadows and Jenna's overactive imagination, but the mood had shifted. The laughter and stories of the previous night were replaced with unease and quiet conversations. Later, as we headed to bed, I couldn't help but glance out the window towards the lake. The moon was full, casting an ethereal light over the water, but there was no sign of the woman Jenna had seen. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a soft, persistent tapping. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the direction of the lake. I crept to the window and peered out, my breath fogging the glass. There, standing at the water's edge, was the woman. Her long white dress billowed in the wind, and her long black hair obscured her face. She was perfectly still, except for one arm which was slowly tapping against the trunk of a tree. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. I had to be dreaming. I forced myself to look again, but she was gone. The tapping had stopped. I tried to shake it off, but sleep eluded me for the rest of the night. The following day, the atmosphere was tense. Jenna looked pale and distracted, and even Mark and Alex seemed on edge. We decided to stick together and spent the day in and around the cabin. As night fell, the sense of dread grew stronger. We sat in the living room, trying to ignore the growing unease. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Jenna screamed and I fumbled for a flashlight, my hands shaking. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the fear on my friends' faces. We heard it then, the soft tapping coming from the front door. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I slowly approached the door, my friends huddled behind me. The tapping continued, relentless and chilling. I took a deep breath and flung the door open, the flashlight revealing nothing but the empty porch and the dark forest beyond. The tapping had stopped, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. We decided to leave the next morning, unable to take another night of terror. As we packed up in the dim light of dawn, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, and there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, her white dress stark against the dark trees. Her hair still obscured her face, but I could feel her eyes on me, cold and unyielding. I blinked, and she was gone. The drive back to the city was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The weekend that was supposed to be a fun getaway had turned into a nightmare. Weeks passed, and life returned to normal, but the memories of that weekend haunted me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. At night, I would wake up to the sound of tapping, only to find nothing there. One night, as I lay in bed, the tapping started again, louder and more insistent. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, filling the room. I got up and looked out the window, expecting to see nothing. But there she was, standing in the street below, her dress glowing in the moonlight, her hair flowing in the wind. She raised her arm and began to tap on the tree in front of my apartment, the sound echoing through the night. I closed the curtains and backed away, my heart pounding. The tapping continued, relentless and inescapable. I knew then that I could never escape her. She had followed me from the lake, and she would haunt me forever. No matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, the woman in the white dress would always find me, and the tapping would never stop. I've lived in my apartment for 3 years now, and until recently, it was my sanctuary. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, it was a place where I could unwind after long days at work and find some solace in the bustling city. However, everything changed when a new neighbor moved into the building across from mine. It started innocuously enough. One evening, as I was making dinner, I glanced out the window and saw a figure standing in the window directly across from mine. He was a tall, thin man, silhouetted by the dim light of his apartment. At first, I thought nothing of it, assuming he was simply looking out at the view. But as the days passed, I noticed he was always there, standing in the same spot, staring directly into my apartment. He never moved, never shifted his gaze. It was unnerving, but I tried to brush it off. After all, it was probably just a coincidence. Maybe he was deep in thought, or just liked standing by the window. Weeks went by and the figure became a constant presence. Every time I glanced out my window, he was there. His eyes, though I couldn't see them clearly, seemed to bore into mine. The feeling of being watched was inescapable, and it started to gnaw at my sanity. I began to close my curtains more often, but the feeling of his gaze still lingered. It was as if I could feel him watching me through the walls, his eyes following my every move. I became paranoid, checking my window obsessively, always finding him there, standing silently. One night, I decided to confront him. Fueled by a mix of fear and anger, I opened my window and shouted across the narrow gap between our buildings. "Hey, what are you doing? Stop staring at me!" He didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his expression hidden in the shadows. I slammed my window shut, my heart pounding, but the confrontation did nothing to ease my anxiety. If anything, it made it worse. My sleep became restless, plagued by nightmares of his face, pale and emotionless, looming over me. The feeling of being watched seeped into every aspect of my life. I couldn't focus at work, and my friends noticed my growing paranoia. I tried to explain it to them, but they just laughed it off, telling me I was overreacting. One evening, I returned home to find a note slipped under my door. It was a simple piece of paper with a single sentence scrawled in neat handwriting: "I see you." My blood ran cold. How did he know where I lived? How did he get into my building? Panic set in as I double-checked all the locks and closed the curtains tightly. But the note had shattered any illusion of safety I had left. That night, the nightmares were worse than ever. I dreamt of him standing in my apartment, his eyes fixed on me as I slept, his breath hot on my face. I woke up in a cold sweat, the feeling of his presence suffocating. Days turned into weeks, and my mental state deteriorated further. I started hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, as if he was speaking to me through the walls. I couldn't escape him. Every time I opened my curtains, he was there. Every time I closed them, I felt his gaze even more intensely. I contacted the building manager, but they dismissed my concerns, claiming they couldn't do anything about someone standing in their own apartment. The police were equally unhelpful, suggesting it was a neighborly dispute and advising me to ignore it. But how could I ignore it? The man in the window had become an omnipresent force in my life, a dark shadow that followed me everywhere. My apartment, once a refuge, had become a prison. I barely left it anymore, too afraid of what I might find when I returned. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a noise from my living room. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on glass. My heart raced as I crept out of bed and made my way to the living room, the tapping growing louder with each step. I reached the window and slowly pulled back the curtain. There he was, standing outside on the fire escape, his face inches from the glass. His eyes, hollow and dark, stared into mine with a terrifying intensity. He raised a hand and tapped on the window, the sound echoing through the silent room. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and falling to the floor. I scrambled to my feet and ran to the door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. I burst out into the hallway, gasping for breath, and pounded on my neighbor's door. They opened it, looking confused and concerned as I babbled incoherently about the man on the fire escape. They called the police, who arrived quickly and searched my apartment. But when they looked out the window, the fire escape was empty. There was no sign of the man, no evidence that he had ever been there. The police left, assuring me it was probably just a prank, but I knew better. He was still out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I packed a bag and left, not caring where I went as long as it was far away from him. I found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town and checked in, hoping the distance would give me some peace. But that night, as I lay in the unfamiliar bed, I heard the tapping again. My blood ran cold as I realized I could never escape him. I pulled back the curtain, and there he was, standing in the parking lot, his eyes locked onto mine. The motel room felt smaller, the walls closing in as his presence suffocated me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, and then the door creaked open. He stepped inside, his eyes never leaving mine. The last thing I saw was his face, pale and expressionless, as he reached out for me. Now I am a prisoner in my own mind, trapped in an endless nightmare. His eyes haunt me, his presence suffocates me. I see him everywhere, feel his gaze on me always. There is no escape, no respite. He is with me, always, forever, and I know now that he always will be. My new apartment was everything I had hoped for, spacious, affordable, and nestled in a quiet neighborhood. There was only one downside, the basement. It was a vast, labyrinthine space, and something about it made my skin crawl. I avoided it as much as possible, but my laundry was down there, and eventually I had to confront my unease. One chilly autumn evening, I gathered my courage and descended the creaky wooden steps into the basement, basket of clothes in hand. The air grew colder and damper with each step, and the faint smell of mildew tingled in my nose. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling cast long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls as it flickered sporadically. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling and focused on the task at hand. The washing machines were tucked away in the far corner, almost hidden by a maze of old furniture and forgotten boxes. I quickly loaded my clothes, eager to finish and get back upstairs. As I poured detergent into the machine, I heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound. I paused, listening intently. The light flickered again, casting the basement into brief moments of darkness. I told myself it was just the old building settling, but my heart rate quickened nonetheless. With the washing machine finally humming, I turned to leave. But as I reached the stairs, the basement door slammed shut with a force that sent a shiver down my spine. I rushed up the steps and tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic began to set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. The only response was the echo of my own voice. The light flickered more violently now, casting the basement into a strobe-like effect. In the disjointed flashes, I thought I saw movement, a shadow darting between the old furniture. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. Desperate to find another way out, I navigated the maze of boxes and broken furniture, my heart pounding louder than the washing machine. As I rounded a corner, I saw something that stopped me cold. A door I had never noticed before, partially hidden behind an old, dusty wardrobe. It was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it inviting and terrifying all at once. Driven by a mix of fear and hope, I approached the door and pushed it open. The hinges groaned in protest, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air was even colder here, and the smell of damp earth was overpowering. I hesitated, but the thought of staying in the basement was even more frightening. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, the flickering light bulbs overhead barely illuminating the path. As I walked, the walls grew closer, the ceiling lower, until I had to crouch to continue. The scraping noise returned, louder now, echoing through the confined space. I pressed on, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The corridor finally opened up into a small, circular room. In the center was a single, ancient-looking chair, and on it sat a doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, one eye missing, and its dress was tattered and stained. The light above the chair flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak flashlight to pierce the blackness. As I shone the light on the doll, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The doll's head had turned to face me. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly backed away, my phone shaking in my trembling hand. The scraping noise grew louder, coming from all around me. I turned and ran back down the corridor, the walls seeming to close in on me, the darkness nipping at my heels. When I reached the basement, the light bulb above the washing machines was still flickering, casting ghostly shadows. The basement door was now wide open, but my relief was short-lived. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadow. The figure moved toward me with an unnatural grace, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. I backed away, stumbling over the old furniture, my heart pounding in my ears. The figure reached out, and I felt a cold, clammy hand on my shoulder. I screamed and bolted for the stairs, my mind a whirl of terror and confusion. I burst through the door and into the safety of my apartment, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the door, trying to convince myself it was all just a nightmare. But when I looked down, I saw a small porcelain hand, cracked and dirty, lying on the floor at my feet. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, slow and deliberate. I realized with a sinking dread that I hadn't escaped the basement at all. The horror had followed me, and there was no way out. Working late at the morgue was never my intention. But the influx of cases had been relentless, and Dr. Morels, the senior pathologist, insisted on clearing the backlog before the weekend. So there I was, surrounded by the quiet hum of refrigeration units, the sterile air thick with the pungent scent of formaldehyde. It was just past midnight when Dr. Morales finally called it a night, leaving me to finish the documentation alone. The morgue at St. Jude's Hospital was located in the basement, a sprawling, windowless space that always seemed colder than the rest of the building. As the only one left, I felt the weight of solitude pressing in. Every sound seemed amplified, the low hum of the refrigeration units, the distant dripping of a leaky faucet, the subtle shifts of air that made the fluorescent lights sway gently. I was updating the logs when the lights flickered. A surge of unease washed over me, but I dismissed it as a symptom of my fatigue. The hospital was old, electrical quirks were common. I returned to my work, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. That's when I heard it, a soft, muffled thumping sound coming from one of the storage cabinets. My heart skipped a beat. The rational part of my mind insisted it was nothing, perhaps a misfiring electrical component or a settling building. But the sound persisted, rhythmic and deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. Against my better judgment, I found myself drawn to the source, Cabinet 12, one of the refrigeration units used to store bodies awaiting autopsy. I stood before it, my hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. The thumping continued, more insistent now. Swallowing my fear, I pulled open the door. Inside, the body of a man in his mid-30s, John Doe, found unresponsive and declared dead on arrival earlier that evening, lay motionless. The thumping stopped abruptly, the silence that followed somehow more terrifying. I scanned the body, looking for any sign of life, but there was none. He was undeniably deceased. Shaken, I closed the cabinet, attributing the noise to some macabre trick of the mind or a physiological post-mortem reaction I had read about but never witnessed. I decided to finish the paperwork as quickly as possible and leave. As I hurriedly typed, the lights flickered again, this time going out completely, plunging me into darkness. The emergency lights flickered to life, casting eerie shadows across the room. That's when I heard it, a whisper, soft but clear, right next to my ear. "Don't leave me in the dark." I spun around, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room, but I was alone. My breaths came quick and shallow, my mind racing. The whisper came again, a desperate, pleading voice. I stumbled backward, my gaze fixed on Cabinet 12. The thumping resumed, louder than before, accompanied by a guttural moan. Panic set in, and I rushed to the exit, my only thought to escape. I slammed into the door, twisting the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was locked in. Turning around, I saw him, the man from Cabinet 12, standing in the middle of the room, his body pale and eyes hollow. He moved toward me, his hand reaching out, as if to drag me back to the darkness he'd come from. I backed away, my hand searching for anything to use as a weapon. I found nothing but air. He was close now, close enough for me to see the despair in his eyes, to feel the cold emanating from his body. His mouth opened, a silent scream that I felt rather than heard, and then he was upon me. They found me the next morning, unconscious on the morgue floor. No sign of disturbance, the cabinets all locked, everything as it should be. But I know what I saw. I never worked late at the morgue again, and sometimes when the lights flicker, I hear the whisper, begging not to be left in the dark, and I wonder if I ever really escaped Cabinet 12. I had always found a certain solace in swimming, the rhythmic strokes and the muffling of the outside world beneath the water's surface, providing a temporary escape. So, when I found out that the local swimming hall offered late-night hours for adult swimmers, it seemed like the perfect antidote to my increasing insomnia and nighttime anxiety. The swimming hall was a grand old structure from the early 1900s, with high ceilings and vast, echoing chambers that amplified even the smallest sound. The first few visits were uneventful, peaceful even, as I glided through the water, the only swimmer in a pool lit by the soft glow of underwater lights. But one night, everything changed. It was a particularly cold and foggy evening when I arrived. The hall was deserted, more so than usual, the attendant at the front desk absent, presumably stepping away for a late dinner. I changed into my swimsuit, relishing the thought of having the place all to myself. As I approached the pool, I noticed the water was unusually still, its surface like glass, undisturbed by the usual filters and pumps. Shrugging off a vague sense of unease, I dove in, the chill of the water a sharp contrast to the steamy air around the pool. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of my strokes. After several laps, I stopped to catch my breath, hanging onto the side of the pool. That's when I heard it, a soft, whispering sound that seemed to echo from the far end of the hall. I looked up, scanning the dimly lit poolside, but saw no one. Thinking it might be the attendant returning, I called out but received no response. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, a garbled cacophony of voices that seemed to rise from the depths of the pool itself. Heart pounding, I swam to the edge, intending to get out, but as I approached the ladder, the water around me stirred. Whirlpools formed, gentle at first, then growing in intensity, pulling me back into the center of the pool. Panic set in as I struggled against the current, my strokes becoming frantic. Then I saw them, faces, pale and distorted, rising from the bottom of the pool, their eyes hollow, their mouths agape in silent screams. They were everywhere, surrounding me, reaching for me with cold, desperate hands. I tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by the water, my efforts to escape futile. The last thing I remember was being pulled under, the faces enveloping me, dragging me down into the cold, dark depths. The water filled my lungs, the voices in my head a deafening roar as everything faded to black. When I awoke, I was lying by the side of the pool, the early morning light streaming through the high windows. I was alone, the water calm and undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. Shaken, I gathered my belongings and left the hall, vowing never to return. But the peace was short-lived. Each night, in my dreams, I find myself back at the swimming hall, the faces waiting for me beneath the surface, their whispers a constant reminder of that night. And each morning, I awake gasping for air, the chill of the water still clinging to my skin. The swimming hall closed soon after, citing structural concerns and plans for renovation. But sometimes late at night, I drive past the old building, its windows dark, its doors locked, and I can hear them, the whispers, calling me back to the water, to join them in the depths where they remain, forever trapped, forever waiting. It was a night veiled in the typical quiet and solitude that had become my new normal. Since moving to a smaller town for work, my social interactions had dwindled, leaving me to find companionship in the corners of internet chat rooms. That's where I met Eclipsed Shadow, a username that stood out in a sea of mundane monikers in a forum dedicated to vintage book collectors, a hobby I had recently taken up to fill the evenings. Eclipse Shadow was knowledgeable and witty, weaving intriguing stories about the rarest finds in obscure shops and auctions. Our chats quickly became the highlight of my evenings, a beacon of excitement in my otherwise mundane routine. We soon moved our conversations to a more private messaging platform, where we shared not only our love for books, but also snippets of our personal lives. One night, as a storm raged outside, Eclipse Shadow sent me a link to what he claimed was a live auction happening in real time. A peculiar but thrilling event, he insisted, that I wouldn't want to miss. Hesitant yet intrigued, I clicked the link, which led me to a dark web page, something I had steered clear of due to its notorious reputation. The page loaded to reveal a live video feed of an old, dimly lit room filled with shelves of books. The camera panned slowly, the eerie silence of the scene punctuated only by the soft, deliberate footsteps of someone out of view. A chat box next to the video filled with comments from anonymous viewers, discussing the items with an unsettling fervor. Eclipsed Shadow messaged me, "Watch closely. I'm sure you'll find this exhilarating." As I watched, a figure stepped into view, a man dressed in a nondescript dark hoodie, his face obscured by a mask. He approached the camera, holding up a book. The cover was old, the leather cracked, and as he opened it, I realized it wasn't a book at all, but a hollowed-out space containing what appeared to be a human finger. A chill ran down my spine as I began to comprehend the true nature of the auction. The chat exploded with bids, each more astronomical than the last, not for rare books, but for the grotesque contents they concealed. I recoiled in horror, my stomach churning as I realized I had stumbled into an auction for items that were unmistakably linked to crimes or worse. I tried to exit, but a private message from Eclipse Shadow stopped me. "Do you like it? I knew you would appreciate something truly unique. Stay, there's more for you to see." Panicked, I typed back, demanding to know what this was all about, why he had brought me here. But there was no response, only the continuation of the auction that grew more macabre with each new book presented. Desperate, I shut down my computer, pulling the plug entirely in a futile attempt to disconnect from the nightmare. I paced my room, unsettled by the storm outside, which seemed to echo the turmoil within me. Unable to calm my nerves, I decided to leave my apartment, seeking the solace of a nearby all-night diner. As I locked my door, a shadow detached itself from the darker end of the hallway. "Leaving so soon?" A distorted voice spoke from behind a mask, the same mask from the auction. I turned slowly, terror gripping me as I faced Eclipse Shadow, no longer a stranger from the internet, but a tangible threat just a few feet away. "I thought you would appreciate a live viewing," he said, stepping closer, a glint of metal in his hand reflecting the lightning that flashed through my window. The storm outside masked the sounds of our struggle, just as the anonymity of the internet had masked the true intentions of Eclipse Shadow. My apartment sat silent and empty, the computer still unplugged, the last message on the screen blinking ominously, "Item sold." In the days that followed, my disappearance was just another case of someone gone without a trace, a story all too common and easily forgotten. The online chats, the auction, the books, they were all traces of a horror hidden behind the veil of digital anonymity, echoes of a voice that whispered through the wires, seeking the next participant for its ghastly collection. I woke up to the hum of fluorescent lights and the antiseptic smell that pervades hospitals. My eyes flickered open, adjusting slowly to the brightness. The room was stark white, the kind of cleanliness that feels almost aggressive. I attempted to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced me back onto the pillow. My mind was foggy, memories elusive. How did I end up here? As I steadied my breathing, I realized the room was unusually silent. There were no beeps from machines, no distant chatter of nurses, no sounds of shoes squeaking against the linoleum floor, nothing but the unnerving silence of abandonment. Confused and growing more anxious by the second, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My body felt strangely heavy, my movements sluggish. I noticed I was dressed in a hospital gown, but I had no recollection of an accident or illness that would have brought me here. Mustering all the strength I could, I ventured into the hallway. It was empty. No doctors, no patients, no staff, just endless stretches of vacant corridors. The overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting ghostly shadows. Papers and medical supplies were strewn across the floor, as if the place had been evacuated in a hurry. My heart raced as I walked, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. Every door I passed was open, revealing more deserted rooms, each as cold and unwelcoming as the last. It felt like walking through a scene from a post-apocalyptic movie. Desperate for answers, I found my way to the nurse's station. Papers lay scattered, monitors were still on, displaying frozen data and time, 2:47 a.m., but it felt later. A newspaper headline caught my eye from a discarded paper. Mysterious illness sweeps the nation. The date was 2 days ago. My stomach churned. Was this why the hospital was abandoned? I continued to search for an exit, or any sign of life, but every new corridor and ward was as deserted as the last. My sense of unease deepened when I reached the main lobby. The automatic doors were jammed, chairs overturned, and the remnants of what looked like a barricade lay broken on the floor. It was clear no one was meant to leave or enter. Through the glass doors, the world outside seemed shrouded in a perpetual twilight. The streets empty, cars abandoned mid-traffic. The city appeared deserted, swallowed by the same eerie quiet that engulfed the hospital. Realizing escape wasn't an option, I retreated back inside, the weight of isolation pressing down on me. In my wandering, I found the hospital's security room. Monitors showed various angles of the hospital and the surrounding area, all equally devoid of life. That's when I saw it, a shadow moving through the hospital corridors on one of the screens. I was not alone. With a mix of terror and hope, I followed the path I had seen on the monitor. The shadow led me to the hospital's lower levels, into the basement where the morgue was housed. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. As I approached, the door to the morgue creaked open on its own. Inside, rows of body bags were all neatly arranged. But it wasn't the dead that terrified me. It was the one empty table, a recently used scalpel lying beside a clipboard with a fresh file. My name was on it, the details of my admittance to the hospital, but under condition, someone had scrawled not in ink, but in what looked disturbingly like blood, awaiting return. That's when I understood. The hospital, the city, they hadn't been evacuated. They had been consumed, and soon I would be too. The darkness at the edges of the room seemed to pulse, drawing closer, the faint whispers of the unwell echoing off the cold tiles. As the shadows closed in, swallowing the flickering lights, my last thoughts were not of escape, but of surrender, an acceptance of my part in this desolate new world. The hospital had been waiting for me, and now I would forever be a part of its silent halls. I woke up in the dead of night, an unnatural chill settling over my bedroom. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making it impossible to find warmth, even under layers of blankets. As I lay there, trying to shake off the lingering remnants of a nightmare, I heard it, the faint, eerie sound of laughter coming from above. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. I sat up in bed, straining to hear through the silence. The laughter continued, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was a child's laughter, high-pitched and filled with an unsettling mirth that sent chills down my spine. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. It was 3:13 a.m., the witching hour. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. There were no children in my house. I lived alone, and the attic had been empty since I moved in. Taking a deep breath, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, my feet sinking into the cold wooden floor. I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to cut through the darkness. The laughter continued, growing slightly louder as I approached the attic door in the hallway. My hand trembled as I reached for the pull cord to lower the attic stairs. With a creak that seemed to echo through the entire house, the stairs unfolded, leading up into the darkness. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I climbed the stairs, the beam of my phone's flashlight dancing across the wooden beams and dust-covered floor. The attic was a dismal place, filled with old furniture covered in sheets and boxes stacked haphazardly. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. I swept the light across the attic, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. There was no response, only the creaking of the house settling around me. As I took another step forward, the laughter started again, this time directly behind me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating nothing but empty space. The laughter grew louder, filling the attic with its haunting sound. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Panic set in, and I backed away, my eyes darting around the attic. Suddenly, the laughter stopped, replaced by a soft, shuffling sound. It was coming from a large old trunk in the corner of the attic, partially covered by a dusty sheet. My heart pounded in my ears as I approached the trunk. The shuffling grew louder, more frantic, as if something inside was trying to get out. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but curiosity and fear compelled me to open it. With a deep breath, I unlatched the trunk and threw open the lid. The flashlight's beam revealed nothing but darkness inside. The shuffling stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, a figure began to rise from the trunk. It was a child, but not like any child I had ever seen. Its skin was pale and translucent, its eyes hollow and empty. It smiled at me, its mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled back, dropping my phone in my haste to escape. The child climbed out of the trunk, its movements jerky and unnatural. It stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes, its smile never wavering. "Come play with me," it whispered, its voice a twisted parody of a child's. The laughter started again, louder and more maniacal than before. I turned and ran, tripping over boxes and furniture as I fled down the attic stairs. The laughter followed me, echoing through the house. I slammed the attic door shut and bolted to my bedroom, my heart racing. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was in my car. I drove aimlessly through the dark, empty streets, my mind racing. The image of the child's hollow eyes and twisted smile burned into my memory. I didn't return to the house for several days. When I finally did, it was in the daylight, with a friend by my side. We searched the attic together, but there was no sign of the child or the trunk. It was as if they had never existed. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. The laughter still haunted my dreams, and the memory of that night lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't escape it, couldn't forget it. And then one night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard it again. The faint, eerie sound of laughter coming from the attic. I knew then that I would never be free. The child, the laughter, the haunting presence in the attic, it would follow me forever, a constant reminder of the night I dared to confront the darkness. It was supposed to be a simple hike through the countryside, a chance to clear my head and escape the hustle and bustle of city life for a weekend. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, imagining the fresh air, the rustling trees, and the open fields stretching out before me. What I hadn't anticipated was the sudden and violent storm that rolled in from nowhere. The sky darkened with alarming speed, turning from a bright, clear blue to a menacing gray. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees and sending leaves flying. Fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a torrential downpour. Within minutes, I was soaked to the bone, the cold rain chilling me to the core. I needed to find shelter, and fast. Squinting through the sheets of rain, I spotted a structure in the distance. It was an old barn, weathered and worn, standing alone in the middle of a vast, overgrown field. I hesitated for a moment, the thought of entering such an ominous place sending a shiver down my spine. But the storm left me no choice. I made my way across the field, the tall grass grabbing at my legs and slowing my progress. By the time I reached the barn, I was shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The barn was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp hay and rotting wood. I closed the door behind me, shutting out the howling wind and driving rain. For a moment, I simply stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light. The interior was cavernous, filled with shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I found a relatively dry corner and huddled there, wrapping my arms around myself in a futile attempt to ward off the cold. The storm raged outside, the wind howling and the rain pounding against the barn's walls. But inside, it was eerily silent, the only sound the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. As I sat there, my mind began to wander. I thought about the stories I had heard about old, abandoned barns like this one. Stories of strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and people who had entered and never returned. I shook my head, trying to dispel the fear that was creeping over me. They were just stories, I told myself. There was nothing to be afraid of. But then I heard it, a faint, rustling sound coming from somewhere deeper in the barn. My heart began to race as I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. It was coming from the far end of the barn, near the old, broken-down stalls. I took a deep breath and stood up, my legs shaking. I knew I should stay put, but curiosity and a growing sense of unease compelled me to investigate. I picked up a broken piece of wood from the floor, holding it like a weapon, and made my way towards the sound. The rustling grew louder as I approached, and I could make out a low, whispering voice. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I rounded the corner of one of the stalls, my makeshift weapon raised, and froze. There in the shadows was a figure crouched on the floor. It was a man, his clothes tattered and his hair matted. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, and I could see that his lips were moving, though I couldn't make out the words. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man didn't respond. He simply stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. I took a step closer, and he flinched, raising his hands as if to ward off a blow. "It's okay," I said, trying to sound soothing despite my own fear. "I'm not going to hurt you." The man lowered his hands, but he continued to whisper, his words now audible but unintelligible. It sounded like some kind of chant, a repetitive and haunting litany that sent chills down my spine. I glanced around, trying to see if there was anyone else in the barn. But it was just the two of us, alone in the darkness. I took another step closer, and the man suddenly lunged at me, his hands clawing at my clothes. "Please," he begged, his voice hoarse and desperate. "You have to help me. It's coming." I stumbled back, dropping my piece of wood in my surprise. "What? What's coming?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he began to weep, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I stood there, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the temperature in the barn plummeted, and a cold, unnatural wind swept through the space. The man's sobs grew louder, more frantic, and he scrambled to his feet, backing away from me. "It's here," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "It's here." Before I could react, the barn was plunged into darkness. The wind howled, and I could feel a malevolent presence closing in around me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing with terror. The man screamed, a blood-curdling sound that echoed through the barn. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear something behind me, a low, growling sound that sent chills down my spine. I reached the barn door and threw it open, the wind and rain hitting me like a wall. I didn't look back as I ran across the field, my only thought to get as far away from that place as possible. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally collapsed on the side of the road, I was soaked and exhausted. I lay there, gasping for breath, my mind replaying the events in the barn over and over. When I was finally found by a passing motorist and taken to the nearest town, I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. They said there was no abandoned barn in the area, that I must have imagined it all. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I know that whatever was in that barn is still out there waiting. And sometimes late at night, I can still hear the man's screams echoing in my mind. When the first kid went missing, the whole town was thrown into a state of panic. Tommy Mullins was a 7th grader at our school, a quiet kid who kept to himself. One day he was there, sitting in the back of the classroom, and the next day, he was gone. No one knew where he went or what happened to him. The police searched everywhere, but they found no trace of him. At first, everyone thought it was a one-time thing. Maybe Tommy ran away, or maybe there was some other explanation. But then, a week later, another kid disappeared. And then another. By the end of the month, 5 kids from our school were missing. The town was in a state of hysteria. Parents were pulling their kids out of school and no one felt safe anymore. I was scared too, but part of me was curious. I wanted to know what was happening, why kids were disappearing without a trace. So I started paying attention, listening to the whispers and rumors that floated around school. There was a lot of talk about the old abandoned house on the edge of town, the one that everyone said was haunted. Some kids claimed to have seen strange lights there at night, and others swore they heard whispers coming from the shadows. One night, I decided to check it out for myself. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to know. I waited until my parents were asleep, then snuck out of the house and biked to the edge of town. The abandoned house stood at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, its windows dark and its walls covered in ivy. It looked like something out of a horror movie. I left my bike hidden in the bushes and approached the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The front door was ajar, creaking on its hinges. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The inside of the house was even creepier than the outside. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the moon shining through the broken windows. The furniture was covered in sheets, and the walls were lined with old photographs, their faces faded and ghostly. I made my way through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something compelled me to keep going. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, the steps creaking loudly under my weight. At the end of the hallway, I found a door that was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dark, but I could make out the shape of a figure standing by the window. My breath caught in my throat and I froze. The figure turned slowly to face me, and I saw that it was a girl about my age. She had long dark hair and pale skin, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The girl didn't answer. She just stared at me, her eyes filled with a strange, haunted look. I took a step closer and she backed away, shaking her head. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You have to leave. It's not safe here." "What's going on?" I asked. "Where are the kids? What happened to them?" The girl shook her head again, tears streaming down her face. "They're gone," she said. "They're all gone, and if you don't leave now, you'll be next." I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get as far away from that house as possible, but another part of me needed to know the truth. I took another step forward, and the girl suddenly lunged at me, her hands gripping my arms. "You don't understand," she said, her voice urgent. "It's not the house, it's the shadows. They take you, and you never come back." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me, and the room was plunged into darkness. I heard the girl's scream, a high, piercing sound that echoed in my ears. I turned and pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The darkness pressed in around me, suffocating and cold. I felt a hand brush against my face, and I spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to move and shift, closing in on me from all sides. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The girl's scream had stopped, replaced by a low, whispering sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was menacing and cruel. I fumbled for my phone, the small light from the screen barely piercing the darkness. I tried to call for help, but there was no signal. I was trapped. The whispering grew louder, and I felt a cold, clammy hand grip my shoulder. I turned and saw a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. I screamed and tried to pull away, but the hand held me fast. The shadows closed in, and I felt myself being pulled into the darkness. I fought and struggled, but it was no use. The last thing I saw was the girl's terrified face, her eyes pleading with me to run. But it was too late. The darkness swallowed me whole, and I felt myself falling into an endless void. When I woke up, I was back in my bed, the morning sun shining through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But then I saw the scratches on my arms, the bruises on my skin. It had been real, all of it. I tried to tell my parents, but they didn't believe me. The police searched the house again, but found nothing. The missing kids were never found, and the town eventually moved on. But I knew the truth. I knew that the shadows were still out there waiting, and I knew that I would never be safe again. It all started as a stupid bet. something to pass the time on a slow Friday night. My friends and I had gathered at our usual spot, a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. We had been talking about ghost stories and urban legends, laughing nervously as we recounted the creepy tales we had heard over the years. Then, Alex brought up the old cabin in the woods. It was a place we all knew about, a decrepit structure that had been abandoned for decades. The stories about it were endless, tales of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and people who went in but never came out. "You wouldn't last a night there," Alex said, grinning wickedly as he took a swig of his beer. "Yeah, I bet you'd be out of there before midnight," Jenna chimed in, her eyes gleaming with mischief. I laughed, trying to brush it off, but something in their taunting got under my skin. "I'll do it," I said, the words out of my mouth before I could stop myself. "I'll stay the night in the cabin." They all stared at me in surprise, then burst out laughing. "No way," Alex said. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "I'll do it tonight." The bet was made, and within an hour, I found myself driving out to the edge of town, the headlights of my car cutting through the darkness. The road was rough and overgrown, barely more than a dirt path leading into the dense forest. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a mixture of fear and adrenaline. I parked the car at the end of the road and grabbed my flashlight and sleeping bag from the back seat. The path to the cabin was narrow and winding, and the trees seemed to close in around me as I walked. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me jump, my mind conjuring up all sorts of terrifying possibilities. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw the cabin. It was even more decrepit than I had imagined. The roof caved in on one side, and the windows shattered. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking ominously in the wind. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of decay. I swept my flashlight around, illuminating the remains of old furniture and debris scattered across the floor. The stories about the cabin filled my mind, but I tried to push them aside. It was just a building, I told myself, nothing more. I unrolled my sleeping bag in what seemed to be the least damaged corner of the cabin and settled in, trying to make myself as comfortable as possible. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked and groaned, but inside the cabin it was eerily silent. Hours passed, and the silence grew heavier, pressing in on me from all sides. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged, as I lay there staring at the ceiling. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Just as I was starting to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound coming from the other side of the cabin. My eyes snapped open, and I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, moving closer, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty, decaying room. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal. But then I heard it again, this time closer. It was a low, whispering voice, indistinct and eerie, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. My blood ran cold as I swept the flashlight around the room, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the voice continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around me, filling the cabin with its sinister murmur. Panic set in, and I scrambled to my feet, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. I had to get out of there. I stumbled towards the door, but as I reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. The whispering grew louder, almost deafening, and I could feel a cold, malevolent presence closing in on me. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the only response was the relentless whispering. In a desperate attempt to escape, I turned and ran towards the back of the cabin, searching for another way out. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I could feel the presence getting closer, its icy breath on my neck. Blindly, I stumbled through the cabin, my hands clawing at the walls for any sign of an exit. The whispering was all around me now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to seep into my very soul. And then I saw it, a faint light, barely more than a glimmer, coming from a small, hidden door in the corner of the room. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I threw the door open and stumbled through, falling into the darkness beyond. I landed hard on the cold, damp ground, the whispering abruptly silenced. I lay there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I sat up, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. I was in a small, underground room, the walls lined with strange, ancient symbols. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and on it lay an old, tattered book. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I approached the altar, reaching out to touch the book. As my fingers brushed the cover, a cold, clammy hand closed around my wrist. I looked up, and there he was, a gaunt, ghostly figure, his eyes hollow and his skin pale as death. He smiled, revealing rows of sharp, decayed teeth. "Welcome," he whispered, his voice like a knife scraping against glass. "We've been waiting for you." The last thing I saw was his face, twisted into a grotesque grin, before the darkness swallowed me whole. My friends found the cabin the next morning, empty and abandoned. They searched for me, calling my name, but there was no trace of me. The only thing they found was my flashlight, lying on the floor by the door. To this day, they don't know what happened to me, but I am still here, trapped in the darkness, a prisoner of the cabin's sinister secret, and I know that I will never escape. It was nearing midnight when I descended into the depths of the Morningside Avenue subway station, the familiar hustle of the city giving way to the hollow echo of my footsteps on the tiled floor. The digital clocks were frozen, the screens that usually showed train times were ominously blank. An unexpected power outage, perhaps, or a technical glitch, I wasn't sure. The platform was deserted, an unusual sight for a city that prided itself on never truly sleeping. The air was thick, musty, like it had been stagnant for years rather than hours. The only light came from the emergency exit signs, their red glow casting eerie shadows that twisted and stretched along the walls. I found a bench and settled down, my eyes scanning the dark tunnel ahead. Trains were frequent on this line, even at night, and I expected to hear the familiar rumble of an approaching train at any moment. Instead, there was silence, a dense, oppressive silence that seemed to muffle every sound except the beating of my own heart. Time stretched on, each minute longer than the last. The usual hum of the underground was absent, replaced by a low, intermittent whispering that seemed to drift out of the tunnel. It was indistinct, unintelligible, as if the dark itself was murmuring secrets meant only for the depths. Trying to ignore the unease that settled in my gut, I pulled out my phone, only to find it unresponsive. Dead battery, a sudden yet explainable occurrence, but unsettling all the same given the situation. As I pocketed the useless device, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was then I noticed a chill in the air, a cold that seeped through my coat and chilled me to the bone. A shape appeared in the tunnel, a darker patch against the impenetrable blackness. My breath caught in my throat as it grew closer, materializing into the form of a person, or what once might have been a person. This figure was ragged, its edges blurry and indistinct as if made of smoke and shadow rather than flesh and bone. Frozen in place, I watched as it stopped just at the edge of the platform, its form wavering slightly as if caught in an unseen breeze. Then, with a sudden clarity that cut through the whispering, it spoke, or rather it hissed, its voice a chilling scrape that echoed around the empty station. "Lost. So lost," it murmured, and the words resonated in my ears like the tolling of a distant bell. I tried to respond, to ask what it was, where it came from, but my voice was a mere whisper compared to its chilling tone. It seemed to hear me, though, for it tilted its head, the shadows around its face swirling. "Join us, never alone," it whispered, and the air around it grew colder, a frost that spread across the platform, creeping towards my feet. I stood, intending to flee, but my legs were unresponsive, heavy as lead. The figure drifted closer, its form becoming more defined, less human. A face not right, too many shadows where eyes should be, a mouth that was a mere slit. The whispering was a cacophony now, voices upon voices, all hissing the same invitation, a siren call that filled the station with the promise of oblivion, of never being alone again. With horror, I realized that the cold had reached me, encasing my legs in a frost that spread upwards, paralyzing, consuming. The last thing I saw was the figure, its face splitting into what might have been a smile, as the darkness enveloped me, the voices becoming my own. Now I wait in the depths of Morningside Avenue Station, another shadow among the whispers, calling to the lonely souls who wander too late into the night. The subway is a network of darkness, of lost things and lost people, and we are never alone. I had never given much thought to the old woman who lived next door. Mrs. Whitaker had always been a reclusive sort, her interactions limited to brief nods or a curt good morning. But something changed in her that summer, something that piqued my curiosity and unease in equal measure. It began subtly. I noticed her spending more time outside, staring intently at her garden, or rather, what remained of it. The once vibrant flowers and shrubs had withered away, leaving behind gnarled branches and dry earth. Yet there she would stand, day after day, whispering to the barren soil as if in deep conversation with an unseen presence. Then, the noises started. At night, I'd hear strange, unsettling sounds emanating from her house. Thuds, as if heavy objects were being moved around, and a repetitive scratching that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. It wasn't long before other neighbors began to notice. Whispers of concern spread, mingling with wild theories about what she might be hiding. Driven by a mix of concern and curiosity, I decided to visit her. I baked a batch of cookies as a pretext, a seemingly innocent gesture that might grant me entry into her house and a glimpse into what was happening. She answered the door after several long moments, her appearance startling. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes wide with a wild, frantic energy. "Is everything all right, Mrs. Whitaker?" I asked as she reluctantly let me in. "Just fine, dear," she rasped, her voice hoarse as if from screaming. "Just fine." The interior of her house was dimly lit, curtains drawn despite the sunny day outside. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and the walls seemed to pulse with a damp, sticky heat. I followed her into the kitchen, where the table was cluttered with what looked like pages torn from old books, strange symbols scrawled across them in a shaky hand. She noticed my gaze and quickly shuffled the papers away. "Just some reading," she muttered. I placed the cookies on the table, her eyes darting nervously to the plate, then back to me. "Mrs. Whitaker, are you sure there's nothing wrong? I've been hearing noises at night." Her demeanor suddenly shifted, her back straightening as she stared at me with intense scrutiny. "You heard them, didn't you? The whispers? They don't like visitors." I recoiled, a chill running down my spine. "Who doesn't like visitors?" "The ones below," she whispered, leaning closer. "They speak to me, through the ground, through the walls. They're angry, hungry. They want to be heard." I stared at her, my initial concern turning to fear. "Mrs. Whitaker, maybe." "No," she snapped, her voice sharp. "You must listen. They are coming. I was trying to warn everyone, but nobody listens. You must listen." Before I could respond, a low rumble shook the house, the floor vibrating under our feet. The scratching noise intensified, louder than ever, as if something, or many things, were clawing their way up from beneath the house. Terrified, I excused myself hastily, stumbling out of her house. The door slammed shut behind me, and as I hurried home, the ground beneath me felt unstable, alive. That night, the neighborhood was filled with screams. I watched in horror from my window as the ground around Mrs. Whitaker's house cracked open, dark figures emerging into the night. The old woman stood among them, her arms raised, her wild laughter mingling with the cries of terror. The police found nothing the next day but an empty house and a gaping hole in the earth. Mrs. Whitaker was never seen again. Some neighbors moved away, while others tried to return to normal. But the whispers didn't stop, not really. Sometimes late at night, I hear them too, scratching at the edges of my mind, a reminder of the darkness that lurks just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. The forest had seemed inviting the day before, a perfect escape into nature, its vastness a promise of solitude and peace away from the chaos of city life. I had arrived with a group of close friends, our spirits high, eager for a weekend of camping in the secluded woods of Old Pine Reserve. We pitched our tents by a gently flowing river, the soothing sound of water mingling with the whispers of the ancient trees. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, the crackling flames casting playful shadows against the backdrop of dense foliage. We shared stories, laughed, and enjoyed the warmth of friendship under the canopy of a starlit sky. Exhausted from the day's activities, I retreated to my tent early, the sound of my friends' muffled conversations lulling me into a deep sleep. However, the serenity did not last. I awoke in complete silence, the kind that presses in on your ears and raises the hairs on your neck. Confused, I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the chilly dawn. The campsite was utterly deserted. Tents remained, flaps open as if hastily abandoned. The campfire was out, its embers cold, and the belongings of my friends were scattered about, left behind in a disarray that spoke of sudden departure, or worse, sudden removal. Panic set in as I called out their names, my voice swallowed by the thick fog that had descended upon the area overnight. There was no response. The forest seemed to absorb the sound, muffling my cries. My phone, my only link to the outside world, displayed no service, the battery perilously low. As I wandered the campsite, a growing sense of dread took hold. Something had happened here, something that had driven my friends into the night or had taken them from it. The river, which had been a comforting presence the day before, now seemed menacing, its waters dark and swirling. Hours passed with no sign of human life. I decided to follow the river, hoping it would lead me to a ranger's station, or at least away from the abandoned camp. The forest around me felt alive, watching and waiting. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves sent shivers down my spine. Then I heard it, a faint, distant wailing that echoed through the trees. Heart-pounding, I followed the sound, desperate for any sign of my friends or any human presence. The wailing grew louder, more desperate, leading me to a part of the forest I didn't recognize, despite my careful observations the day before. I came upon a clearing, and the sight that greeted me halted me in my tracks. A circle of ancient stones stood in the center, their surfaces covered in moss and strange markings. Within the circle, the source of the wailing became apparent. A figure, shrouded in a dark cloak, was crouched over something, a small makeshift altar, it seemed, upon which lay a disturbing array of items, small bones, feathers, and a single, flickering candle. The figure turned as I approached, its face obscured by the hood. In a voice that was barely human, it spoke, not to me, but to the air around us. The spirits have been angered, the pact has been broken, they demand a tribute. Frozen in fear, I could only watch as the figure raised its arms, the wailing reaching a crescendo. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The figure vanished, leaving behind the eerie silence that had first greeted me upon waking. I ran, heedless of direction, until exhaustion overtook me. When I finally returned to my senses, I was back at the campsite, as if I had never left. My friends' belongings were gone, the tents dismantled, no trace of their previous presence, or mine. I left Old Pine Reserve that day, but the peace I once sought from nature was forever marred. At night, I still hear the wailing, a mournful reminder of the cost of disturbing things that lie hidden, waiting in the silent, watchful woods. The memory of the clearing, the stones, and the dark figure haunt my dreams, a chilling echo of the day I woke up alone, abandoned by my friends to an ancient, unforgiving wilderness. The storm came out of nowhere, as if the sky itself had split open, unleashing a torrent of rain and wind that transformed the landscape into a writhing, chaotic mess. I was far from town, my car's tires struggling against the mud-slicked back roads, when the first branches began to snap, whipped around by the gale like broken limbs. Visibility was almost nil, the headlights of my car barely piercing the sheet of rain that enveloped everything. When a particularly violent gust of wind sent a tree crashing down just feet ahead of my stalled car, I knew I had to find shelter, and fast. I remembered passing an old barn a few miles back, little more than a silhouette against the darkening sky. With no better options and the storm intensifying, I abandoned my car and made my way back down the road, fighting against the wind that seemed determined to push me back with every step. The barn loomed out of the darkness as I approached, its structure massive and foreboding. It was old, the wood weathered and groaning with every gust of wind, as if moaning in protest. I hesitated at the entrance, the darkness inside seeming almost palpable, but the rising howl of the storm behind me spurred me forward. Inside, the barn was cavernous, the smell of old hay and rust strong in the air. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam flickering to life and cutting through the darkness. It illuminated rows of old farm equipment, their metal surfaces rusted, and beyond that, stalls that looked like they hadn't housed animals in decades. As I ventured deeper, trying to find a dry spot to wait out the storm, I heard it, a soft, whispering sound, almost lost beneath the roar of the wind outside. I stopped, shining my light around, half convinced I'd imagined it. But then it came again, a whisper that seemed to emanate from the shadows themselves, words indistinguishable but unmistakably human. "Help us." The voice was faint, desperate. I swung my flashlight towards the back of the barn, where the shadows gathered thickest. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small and hollow in the vast space. "Is someone there?" No answer came, but the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "Help us, please." Compelled by a mix of fear and concern, I moved towards the sound, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. It led me to a corner of the barn that seemed even older, the wood here black with age and damp. The light flickered over something that made me stop dead, a chain, old and rusted, that trailed away into the darkness. I followed it with trepidation, the metal links clinking softly as I traced them to their end. They were attached to shackles, bolted to the wall, and within them were bones, human bones, shackled and left to rot in the darkness. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, horror flooding through me. The whispering crescendoed into a wail, a sound of agony and despair so palpable that I felt it in my very bones. The air grew colder, the darkness seeming to press in on me from all sides. I turned to run, but the storm outside had worsened, the barn doors slamming shut with a force that sent dust billowing through the air. I was trapped, the wailing filling my ears, the bones in the shackles rattling as if animated by the voices themselves. The barn became my prison, the storm outside relentless, the voices never ceasing. They whispered of betrayal, of suffering, of a darkness that had seeped into the very wood and earth of this place. I realized then that the barn didn't just house the remnants of the past. It was a tomb, a holding place for souls too tormented to find peace. I never made it out of that barn. When they finally found me, days later, the storm long passed. I was huddled in the corner, my eyes wide open, whispering along with the voices that would never let me go. The barn claimed me, another soul shackled to its darkness, another whisper in the wind.